Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change will now come to order. Today, the subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled Pollution and Pandemics, COVID-19's Disproportionate Impact on Environmental Justice Communities. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Adam Fisher at the email address we've provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. COVID-19 obviously has drawn a lot of attention, and as an epidemic, we know that it has exposed and in many cases worsened longstanding environmental injustices. Communities exposed to particulate matter and other air pollutants that cause asthma, COPD, and other respiratory illnesses are now at even greater risk of death from COVID-19. A devastating illness that we know is disproportionately impacting communities and affecting minority and low-income communities. According to a recent CDC analysis, African Americans represented 33% of COVID hospitalized patients and nearly a quarter of COVID deaths, despite only comprising 18% of the communities studied. These disparities are even greater in certain communities. EPA has taken numerous deregulatory actions over the past 3.5 years, including adopting a non-enforcement policy during the pandemic, leaving many communities wondering who, if anyone, will stand up to protect their health and their safety from very real and lasting harm. Our members of this subcommittee have made environmental justice a top priority, and we are committed to ensuring environmental justice is central to our work moving forward. I want to recognize and thank several of our subcommittee members, in particular Dr. Ruiz and Mr. Mitigation, who fought to include language in the HEROES Act to codify EPA's environmental justice grant program and provide up to $50 million to build capacity of environmental justice community groups. The HEROES Act also requires states and utilities receiving federal emergency funds to take steps to prevent water and energy shutoffs for the duration of the COVID-19 emergency, and establishes a new program to help people with payments for drinking water and wastewater expenses. I want to recognize Mrs. Dingle for her leadership on these vital measures. These are good and important policies, but this work is nowhere close to done. Communities that have long faced the worst injustices continue to suffer more air pollution and vulnerability to our changing climate. Our approach must be equal to this challenge, building a comprehensive strategy that works to restore environmental justice for communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. Today, we will hear from experts on how COVID is impacting communities that already face disproportionate harms from pollution. We welcome Mr. Patterson and Mr. Shays to the subcommittee, and welcome back Mr. Ali. Thank you for grounding us in this timely and necessary discussion as we grapple with our national history and present of systemic racism. We need to deepen our awareness of our environmental policies and their disproportionate consequences. There is a reason we call this convening a hearing. As members of Congress, we need to listen. Listen to the communities who have felt these unfair, unjust impacts for decades. Listen to the experts who have done the work for years and are best prepared to offer meaningful perspectives and material solutions. And we must resolve to hear them and then act accordingly to address these longstanding harms. I look forward to hearing your perspectives on the intersection of environmental justice and COVID-19. And I yield the remaining time to one of the great leaders in Congress on these issues, the subcommittee vice chair, Dr. Ruiz. Dr. Ruiz?
Thank you, Chairman Tonko and the witnesses for joining us today. COVID-19 has exacerbated what we have known all along, that low-income rural communities and minority communities have greater disparities in health. One reason is because they are more likely to experience environmental justice, disproportionately breathing polluted air and drinking dirty water due to neglect or decisions by others that affect their environment. That's why I introduced H.R. 66992, the Environmental Justice COVID-19 Act, which would authorize $50 million for EPA EJ grant programs to monitor pollution, investigate the impact of COVID-19 on environmental justice communities. I also introduced the comprehensive H.R. 3923, the Environmental Justice Act of 2019, which requires agencies to consider the environmental justice implications of their programs, policies, and activities to help protect our communities and vulnerable populations. I want to thank Mr. Ali, one of our witnesses here today, who worked with us on this bill. As a physician and someone who represents constituents who have experienced too many environmental injustices, I am committed to working with members of this committee to create a cleaner and healthier environment for all. Thank you. I yield back. Chairman, you're on mute.
I'll learn this thing eventually. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. Good to see you there, Mr. Ranking Member. And the floor is yours. And you need to unmute.
Thing. I'm in DC with Congressman McKinley and Congressman Johnson. I did check the doors to 2123. You did have them locked this time, so that's why we're down here, and it's great to be with you. An important hearing. I know Doc Burgess also asked for racial disparities on health outcomes, so this kind of merges along with Dr. Burgess' request, and he's joining us and waving on to the hearing today. Today's hearing topic is especially timely given all the nation has confronted in recent weeks amid the human toil of the pandemic, from disease and deaths and unprecedented economic shutdown. Our nation is now having raw and necessary conversations in response to the George Floyd's tragic and necessary death. Against this backdrop, this hearing aims to explore the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on minority, low-income, and other disadvantaged communities around the nation. I agree with the chairman's comments announcing the hearing that we should focus on the resources to address the environmental and economic hardships the pandemic has laid bare. Nobody should dispute the human toil when economic opportunity abandons communities. February's testimony this year from the United Utility Workers Union in America described how harmful effects on family and the economic, social, and physical collapse of communities that follow the loss of good blue-collar middle-class jobs as factories pull out or power plants close down. Whether community collapse is from losing economic opportunity or not having the opportunity in the first place, the solution is the same: remove barriers and provide incentives to lift economic prospects for those most in need. This is the surest way to help people, their health, and their environment. The good news is there are practical policies and resources available to address some of the environmental issues, revitalization needs, and barriers to increasing economic opportunity for disadvantaged communities. During the subcommittee's hearing on this subject last fall, we examined how EPA works to help ensure these communities have the information, the know-how to participate in local and state planning. Witnesses provided compelling examples how EPA's technical assistance, EJ grants, and land revitalization and brownfields programs improved environmental quality and economic prospects for communities, in large part by providing the front-end improvements that leverage tremendous amount of additional private economic investment. It is a credit to this committee's bipartisan work updating the brownfields program that today we can look forward to increased economic progress for low-income, minority, and other disadvantaged communities across the nation that use these tools. In terms of the pandemic and the environment, we're a long way from having a full picture of the relationship of COVID and pollution on low-income and minority communities. To be sure, CDC's official data shows that there has been a disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black mortality overall in many states, but not all states. And it is widely understood that pollution burdens can have a disproportionate impact on people with chronic underlying health problems like diabetes, asthma, cardiovascular disease, and on disadvantaged communities, given all these other factors that impact welfare and healthcare access. but one-off studies should not prioritize how we address the problems. Congressional critics of the administration have cited a widely reported and criticized Harvard University study in early April to say EPA air quality decisions are off track. This study hypothesized that particulate matter levels increase COVID-19 risk. But even the unpublished paper's senior author told the Washington Post that this was preliminary and the study should not be used for policymaking. For committee purposes, it is more helpful to take lessons from EPA's official annual air trends report, which was released yesterday, and I ask unanimous consent that that be submitted for the record. This shows continued reduction in air pollution around the nation. It reports 40% reduction in the number of days listed as unhealthy for sensitive groups. This demonstrates that allowing states to implement existing standards continues to drive cleaner air and is positive news for everyone. Let's focus on what works. In the same way, programs to accelerate economic opportunity should also be allowed to make a difference. For that reason, I would like to welcome Shay Hawkins today, President of the Opportunity Funds Association. Mr. Hawkins will talk about the great potential for bipartisan establishment of opportunity zones enacted in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to tie into existing programs in low-income and disadvantaged communities to attract the private capital necessary to assist economic development and jobs creation. Mr. Hawkins can talk about how the program works, how it can work with existing EPA programs, and what can be done to improve and expand it to better address the pressing issues confronted disadvantaged communities today. This is the kind of bipartisan program we should work with to the benefit of all people and communities in need as we seek economic recovery, and I look forward to the discussion. I also have with me, Mr. Chairman, a list of the economic zones in Illinois. There's 326 of them throughout the state. Many in my district in rural poor areas, but also 180 in Cook County. And with that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Chairman Pallone, chair of the full committee of Energy and Commerce, for 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Today, we're continuing the committee's work to combat the COVID-19 pandemic by looking at its disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities. And it's heartbreaking to think that more than 100,000 Americans have died from this horrible virus. It's also alarming to see the devastatingly high rates of infection and death for communities of color, low-income communities, Native American communities, and fence-line communities, those that, for example, the communities adjacent to chemical plants or Superfund sites, of which we have many in my home state of New Jersey. And we often refer to these communities as environmental justice communities because they're the ones most in need of environmental justice. For too long, the people living in these communities have borne a disproportionate share of pollution and its health risk. It's these risks that are contributing to people of color dying from the coronavirus at significantly higher rates than others. And we've long known that particulate matter and other forms of air pollution cause respiratory disease, including asthma. We've also known that low-income communities and communities of color are exposed to higher concentrations of air pollution because for years, polluters have chosen to build their facilities in these communities. And as a result, low-income people and people of color suffer greater incidence of respiratory disease and other adverse health effects. And now we have scientific evidence showing a direct link between communities living with more air pollution and high rates of COVID-19 deaths. So we simply can't allow this to continue. And unfortunately, the Trump administration is only making the public health and environmental crisis worse. When the Trump administration rolls back protections under the Clean Air Act, it hurts these communities most. When this administration announces that it will not enforce some environmental laws and regulations during the pandemic, that hurts these communities too. And when President Trump issues an executive order circumventing the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, that completely cuts the voices of these communities out of the decision-making process. So this subcommittee continues to focus on fighting for environmental justice. And Representative Ruiz already spoke, led the effort to increase environmental justice grants in response to COVID-19 as part of the HEROES Act, which passed the House last month. Representative Mitigation, the co-author of that bill, has also been a leader in developing other comprehensive legislation on environmental and climate justice. And I also wanted to thank Chairman Tonko and Rush for working with me to include an environmental justice section in our Clean Future Act that we unveiled in January. So this hearing is happening at a truly crucial moment in our nation's history. We're fighting a global pandemic. Tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs. And of course, peaceful protesters are demanding racial justice following the murder of George Floyd. So we have a lot of work to do. I just want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. And I wanted to yield the 2 minutes I have left, Mr. Tonko, first to a minute to Mr. McEachin, and then 1 minute to Representative Rush. So I'll yield now to Representative McEachin first.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, and thank you for yielding your time and lending us your leadership. As people across our country come together to pray for peace and demand action, I am proud to serve with you on a committee that recognizes its role and its responsibility to fight injustice. The pain and anger brought about by the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and too many other Black Americans has forced our nation to have a real and urgent discussion about systematic racism and inequality. Like those before me, I know firsthand the dissonance of a lived experience that does not reflect the inalienable rights of every American. Like those before me, I have hoped and prayed that swift action will finally be taken to protect Black lives from violence. And watching Americans of all races and backgrounds take to the streets has shown me that our nation is at a critical point. We can, must, and we are rising together to fight for justice in all its forms. For too long, Black and brown and underserved communities have suffered the devastating impacts of environmental injustice, living on the front lines of our climate crisis and fence lines of polluting industries, often without the necessary resources to respond to the impacts, nor the influence in the political process to promote equitable outcomes. The fact that Black Americans are disproportionately dying of COVID-19 exposes the deadly consequences of this truth. It is a truth that we cannot and will not accept. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
If there's any time left, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to give it to Mr. Rush.
We'll yield half a minute to Mr. Rush, please.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Hear you. Hello? The chairman has yielded to you, Representative Rush.
Hear me now?
Muted.
Can you hear me?
You now. Sorry there, Bobby.
All right. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for yielding to me. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought our nation to a screeching halt. That we face our most vulnerable communities, especially the Black and brown communities. These woes have not diminished and they have not waned at all. These remain ever present in our healthcare system, our criminal justice system, and even in the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. While our nation mourns the loss of George Floyd and other victims of systemic racism, we must not forget the myriad of other injustices that are facing our communities. We must use this increased focus as an opportunity to shine a bright light on important issues such as environmental justice issues and issues of the environmental justice community. With that, I thank Chairman Pallone and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your extraordinary leadership and for convening today's critical hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Chair yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes, please, for your opening statement.
Thank you,
Representative
Chairman.
Walden.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. Thank you to Chairman Pallone as well. I know Mr. Flores was trying to get back into the system. He got knocked out, just for our technical folks. The last 3 months have exposed the deep challenges our country faces. Coronavirus pandemic swept across the globe. It left in its wake tremendous loss of life, including more than 110,000 of our citizens who lost their lives in the United States alone. Massive economic upheaval with tens of millions of American workers losing their jobs and drastic adjustments to each of our daily lives. And then recently, our nation was rocked again by the senseless and unjust death of George Floyd. This incident highlighted the systemic challenges facing the Black community in America. And I join those who have raised their voices to protest the deadly brutality imposed on George Floyd and other instances of shocking, unacceptable violence against minority communities in the United States. I share everyone on this committee's call for real and sustained work to pursue reforms that will actually make a difference to successfully address these difficult and these complex issues. Listen, learn, act. As a country, we should be listening to others with different viewpoints and backgrounds, learning about their experiences and feelings, and taking action to form a more perfect union that ensures justice and equality are available to all Americans, regardless of skin color. In many ways, today's hearing seems to touch upon all these different circumstances. There's bipartisan desire to explore how COVID-19 disproportionately impacted minority communities, whether it be socially, environmentally, or economically. Indeed, last month, Dr. Burgess, the Republican leader on the Health Subcommittee, sent a letter to the Democrat majority requesting a hearing on racial disparities related to COVID-19 and how Congress can reduce these disparities. More examination is needed to understand those health outcomes and how to improve them. And I hope the majority will take Dr. Burgess up on his request. Whether it's healthcare or the environment, one of the most important keys to addressing the challenges of community of color, including COVID-19, is economic development. Economic prosperity can bring employment opportunities, better healthcare, improved education, a healthier environment, more efficient emergency services, stronger tax base, and new infrastructure. We've seen this work in our committee that's done to help spur economic development across American communities. For example, last Congress, we worked together to reauthorize and improve the EPA's Brownfields program. Under this program, EPA awards grants to local communities to repurpose abandoned, closed, or underutilized sites into new infrastructure, such as parks and sports stadiums. It's estimated that $100,000 of Brownfields grant money on average be leveraged into 8.5 jobs, real dollars, real jobs, real change. There's also Opportunity Zones programs, which was a bipartisan effort enacted in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Opportunity zones are economically distressed communities located in urban, rural, and tribal areas selected by governors of each state and territory and the mayor of DC. The Opportunity Zones program aims to encourage economic development in these areas through tax incentives, and we've seen encouraging results from this initiative. So I look forward to hearing more about this program today and how it can improve and enrich communities all across America. According to one of our witnesses, Mr. Hawkins, the head of the Opportunity Funds Association, nearly $10.8 billion had been secured by the Opportunity Funds prior to COVID-19. Again, real dollars, real change, and that will result in real jobs and real economic opportunities. Everyone sacrificed during this economic shutdown, but without question, hourly workers and distressed economic communities have suffered the most. Construction workers alone lost almost 1 million jobs just in April. Workers that can telecommute have been inconvenienced, but have not felt the same economic pain suffered by these other groups. That's why if we care about these communities, we need to reopen the economy and do it safely. We also need to reject overly burdensome regulations that might sound good in a soundbite, but do little to help the environment while keeping workers from finding good paying jobs. Throughout my congressional career, I focused on solutions, on identifying and understanding challenges, and then working together to find bipartisan effective solutions to those challenges. My Republican colleagues and I sincerely believe that economic development, as well as employment and educational opportunities, are key solutions to addressing many of the disparities for rural, minority, and economically distressed communities. Those are foundational tools for a prosperous society and a vital community. Translation, real dollars, real jobs, real change. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I yield back the balance of my time.
You're most welcome. And the gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written and opening statements shall be made part of the record. We now move to our witnesses, and I'll now introduce the witnesses for today's hearing. First, we have Ms. Jacqueline Patterson, Senior Director of the Climate and Environmental Justice Program at the NAACP. Next, we have Mr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation. And then finally, we have Mr. Shay Hawkins, who serves as President of the Opportunity Funds Association. I now recognize Ms. Patterson, for 5 minutes to provide an opening statement.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you so much to the Committee on Energy and Commerce and its Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. A special thank you to Anthony and Adam, who stuck with me in spite of my non-compliance with all logistical directions leading up to these remarks. Anyway, thank you all for your leadership in convening this critical conversation, particularly in these times when the chronic and systemic racial disparities are in the spotlight for our nation. As we all know, the same systemic inequities that make certain populations differentially vulnerable to various impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic are the same systemic underpinnings that comprise the root causes driving environmental injustice, including climate change. Racism, xenophobia, sexism, combined with poverty, housing insecurity, racial profiling, differential access to healthcare, under-resourced education, privatized criminal justice, and disproportionate exposure to pollution that attacks the lungs, rendering communities even more vulnerable to COVID-19 that also targets the lungs. These are all critical commonalities. One recent study found that even small increases in fine particulate matter, such as PM 2.5, have an outsized effect on COVID-19 in the United States. An increase of just 1 microgram per cubic meter corresponded to a 15% increase in COVID-19 deaths. Evidence shows that people who have been living in places that are more polluted over time, they're more likely to die from the coronavirus. In the same study, which looked at 3,080 counties in the United States, people who had lived in counties with long-term pollution exposure for 15 to 20 years had significantly higher mortality rates, likely due to the higher risk of existing respiratory and heart diseases in the areas of high pollution. And these are our communities. To add to the injustice, African American and Latino American people are typically exposed to 56 and 63% more PM 2.5 pollution than they produce through consumption and daily activities. Yet another dimension to the injustice. Furthermore, the health effects associated with indoor air pollution include respiratory illnesses, heart disease, and cancer, each of which have been linked to increased vulnerability to mortality due to COVID-19. And once again, African Americans are more likely to have respiratory conditions exacerbated by indoor air pollution. Once again, we have a response by the administration that prioritizes protecting the profits of big corporations while comparatively neglecting to advance action at the scale and depth that truly upholds the well-being of people. As we talked about in our NAACP fossil-fueled foolery report last year, the tie between corporate interests and some of our policymakers and our policies are far too enmeshed. Instead of strengthening regulations to reinforce protections for our communities that are made vulnerable by poor air quality, we have an administration that has rolled back over 100 regulations in the context of COVID-19, thereby paving the pathway to poisoning of our communities. All of this combines to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and other communities are facing the harshest fallout of direct impact of COVID-19, just as we in the EJ community saw in Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil drilling disaster, and more. In each and every one of these disasters, including the COVID-19 pandemic, with racism as a through line that imperils us at every turn, not just in extreme circumstances just such as disasters, but merely when we're walking in a park, making a purchase in a store, jogging down the street, sleeping in a dorm hallway, sleeping in our own bedrooms, in our own homes, or merely just breathing air. These are simple actions that white American people take for granted, not as risky to their very existence. But time and time again, we've seen how structural inequities lead to inequities in health, well-being, and our very existence on Earth. Modern day redlining leads to under-resourced infrastructure and lack of choices in our communities. We have 71% of African Americans living in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. We have the domination of policies by big agriculture and domination of our markets with foods high in sodium, sugar, and preservatives. We're more likely to get a Cheeto or a Dorito than a quinoa or kale. The lack of green space has made us less likely to exercise. And the combination of these factors leads to the very illnesses that have made us more vulnerable to COVID-19 at worst and shortens our lifespan and quality of life, even in the absence of this pandemic. At every turn, the deck is stacked against us. And the very people who pay the price include people like Louisiana matriarch Antoinette Franklin and her three sons living in one of our nation's most polluted petrochemical corridors. They all died within days of each other of COVID-19. To pivot to solutions, the good news is that our communities are organizing ourselves to build solutions to what's before us now with COVID-19, and including the challenge of climate change, given the common underpinnings and impacts. Frontline communities are rising up and putting together platforms of reforms at the federal, state, and local level. At the same time, we're implementing changes on the front lines, forging linkages, organization to government entity, nonprofit to nonprofit, and so forth. Communities are demanding reinstatement and strengthening of our environmental regulations. We're demanding research and policy on racial impact analysis. We're doing our own testing and monitoring of air, water, and soil quality. We're calling for stronger regulations on household products and a more inclusive toxic release inventory. Communities want policies that support localism and regenerative design, as well as clean energy and building and vehicle electrification. Communities are calling for the retirement of coal debt, of rural electric co-ops that are struggling to survive and serve their member owners. And we're rising up against systemic racism. Thank you so much. I'll end by saying that people in power must get behind those on the front lines. Again, get behind the leadership of frontline communities to scale up, scale deep, and scale forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us, Ms. Patterson, and for your statement. Next, we will recognize Mr. Ali. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Ali, you might have to unmute.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Thank you. You have 5 minutes, please.
All right. Well, you missed the best parts in that first 3 seconds. Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shemkus, and members of the committee, on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, our 52 state and territorial affiliates, and more than 6 million members and environmental justice communities across the country, thank you for the honor of testifying before you today. I was thinking about this testimony, and I was raised in a family of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, deacons and deaconesses, so my grandmother came to my mind, and she used to have a favorite verse that said, and it's Amos 5:24. Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all I want. My grandmother used to say, when you know better, do better. Today's hearing comes at a critical moment in the history of our country. Frontline communities are under attack from multiple emergencies happening at the same time. Black communities are dealing with the systemic racism that has infected the policing in our communities that is literally choking us to death. The rolling back of environmental rules and regulations has us gasping for air due to the cumulative public health impacts from the burning of fossil fuels in our communities. COVID-19 continues to devastate Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, both in infections and deaths. So when we say, I can't breathe, we literally can't breathe. Over 2 million Americans have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 113,000 have died. Communities of color across our nation's health and wealth are being impacted by the burning of fossil fuels that is a significant driver in the climate crisis and the impacts from the coronavirus that we find ourselves dealing with. We have over 500,000 homeless citizens in our country, and many of them are at risk both from air pollution and the lack of clean, accessible water, which is critical to both personal hygiene and the ability to protect oneself from COVID-19 infections. The last time I joined you, I shared that disproportionately, the majority of fossil fuel facilities are located in communities of color, lower wealth communities, and on indigenous lands. 2.4 million miles of pipeline is crisscrossing our country, traveling through indigenous land, through farm country, and ends up on the Gulf Coast in vulnerable communities who often have to bear the burdens of these toxic exposures. As has been mentioned earlier, in our country, we have over 100,000 people who are losing their lives each year prematurely to air pollution. That's more folks that are dying from toxic air than are dying from gun violence. We have 25 million with asthma and 7 million kids, and many of our communities of color and lower income and lower wealth communities are literally dying for a breath of fresh air. We know that many of our communities are closely located to toxic facilities, and they are suffering from chronic medical conditions, heart disease, liver disease, kidney disease, and lung diseases, as well as the cancer clusters that we find across our country. We also know that these chronic medical conditions make people more susceptible to the coronavirus. Unfortunately, there are communities who are also in medically underserved areas, which compounds the impacts by making it difficult to access proper medical advice and treatment. To add additional insult to injury, the Trump administration decided to stop enforcing environmental laws due to the pandemic. The current administration has also diligently been weakening U.S. environmental protections, even amid the coronavirus crisis, by rolling back the Clean Car Rule and instituting the executive order rollback that we saw as weakening the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA. Each of these current actions and a list of previous actions makes overburdened communities more vulnerable today and in the future. I just want to hit a couple of quick facts that I want to make sure folks are aware of as I close out. In 2018, EPA's own National Center for Environmental Assessment shared a study focusing on particulate matter in our country that highlighted the fact that people of color are much more likely to live near pollution and breathe polluted air. The study went on to share that people in poverty are exposed to more fine particulate matter than people above poverty. And the International Agency for Research in Cancer named particulate matter as a known definite carcinogen, and has been named by the EPA as a contributor to a number of significant health conditions, along with heart disease, lung conditions, high blood pressure, low birth weight for babies, and asthma. So I know I'm about to run out of time, but I just want to highlight a couple of quick things that we have to pay attention to. We got 80 million people in our country who are uninsured and underinsured, which is creating an additional set of challenges. We talked about the medically underserved areas, which are often also located in what we call frontline communities or our most vulnerable communities. And we also know that we have a wealth gap that exists inside of our country. So I'm thankful to this committee that you are thinking critically, one, about addressing the environmental and public health impacts that continue to happen, and how we also make sure that we are merging economic opportunities. And I'm one who believes that we have an incredible amount in the clean energy space. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today and unpacking many of these challenges that still exist and a pathway forward.
Thank you, Mr. Ali, and thank you for your presentation. We look forward to the conversation. And now, Mr. Hawkins, welcome again. Thank you for joining us. You are now recognized for 5 minutes, and please unmute if you haven't.
All right. Well, Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and the members of the committee, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I am the president of the Opportunity Funds Association, a trade association whose members are entrepreneurs, investors, developers, and fund managers operating in opportunity zones. The Opportunity Funds Association is an advocacy, education, and communications organization established to enable our members to participate in public policy, share best practices, and communicate the industry's contributions to distressed rural and urban communities across the country. So through our members, we connect capital to overlooked areas, improving lives, creating opportunities, and ensuring the long-term economic growth in America's most vulnerable communities. So prior to co-founding the Opportunity Funds Association, I was tax counsel for Senator Tim Scott, representing South Carolina. And while working for Senator Scott, I was helping him to champion the Investing in Opportunity Act. The Investing in Opportunity Act was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was authored on the Senate side by Senator Cory Booker and Senator Tim Scott. and the House side version was authored by Representative Ron Kind and Representative Pat Tiberi. This legislation allows individuals or corporations with a capital gain to defer payment of taxes on that capital gain, provided that they reinvest that capital gain in one of 8,700 distressed communities across the 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. The areas that are eligible for this benefit were selected by governors. Every governor was able to designate 25% of the economically distressed census tracts in their state or territory as opportunity zones. And so that selection process happened shortly after the Opportunity Zone provision, which was based on the Investing in Opportunity Act, was passed in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so when we're looking at the residents of these designated opportunity zones, we're looking at areas that have a higher than normal population of African Americans, a higher than average population of non-whites overall. We're looking at areas with a higher poverty rate, obviously. And we're looking at areas that also have lower median incomes and higher rates of brownfields. So of the opportunity zones that were selected, about 10% of those, those represent about 10% of US Census tracts overall. But they represent over 30% of America's brownfields are found in these areas and in these census tracts. And so, the Opportunity Zone provision provides a special chance that we have to help create jobs in areas for folks who are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. So as of April 30th, 2020, $10 billion have been attracted into opportunity funds, which are the vehicles that invest in opportunity zones. And Secretary Mnuchin estimates that over $100 billion to come into opportunity zones over the next decade. So it's a great tool. Of the $65 million that have gone into brownfield remediation programs and those grants, of the 150 designated areas and designated grant projects, 118 of those are in areas that overlap with opportunity zones, so that the folks who are dealing with those remediation dollars will be able to also take advantage of the opportunity zone provision as well. So again, great potential here to help alleviate the conditions for folks who are living in opportunity zones that directly overlap with economic justice communities. And I look forward to talking to the committee about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hawkins. Thank you for joining us and thank you for your input. That concludes our witnesses' statements. We'll now move to member questions. And I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Again, let me thank our witnesses for their testimony. I believe it is critically important that we measure our response to the COVID pandemic by how we respond to the needs of our most vulnerable and most impacted citizens. So, Ms. Patterson, from your perspective, why should environmental justice be an important component of addressing COVID-19?
Thank you so much. Yes, both from the direct connections that we see in terms of the places with high levels of pollution being the places where we see more COVID-19 impacts. That's a direct correlation that that calls on us to address air quality as a way of mitigating the impact of COVID-19. But then also, as I was saying before, the systemic underpinnings that make communities much more vulnerable to COVID-19 and to environmental injustices are something that we have to very explicitly address, or we're going to see ourselves in the same position time and time again going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Ali. why do you think it is necessary that our COVID response and recovery efforts be centered around righting what have been historic injustices?
Well, there are a number of reasons why we have to do that. One, these injustices cost our country a huge amount of money in relationship to the health impacts that are going on. It also affects a number of other things that go on in people's lives and the communities that have been disinvested in. Everything from education to housing to a number of the other components that stop communities from being able to move from surviving to thriving, if you will. So we have a huge amount of opportunity right now to redirect and reinvest in these communities, because the reality of this situation is that this is not the only pandemic that we are going to face. And if we are not willing to help these communities to become resilient and to build the foundations that are going to be necessary to deal with future pandemics, to deal with what we're going to have happening today and tomorrow in relationship to the climate emergency, then it's going to end up costing us much more. So it just makes sense to invest today and not wait until tomorrow.
And many members and stakeholders, including businesses, are talking about building back better. So, Mr. Ali and Ms. Patterson, do you think we can truly claim to be building back better if we don't address historic and disproportionate pollution burdens?
Hi, thank you. Very good question. Yeah, so I think it's impossible. I mean, we have to address the pollution burdens, or we won't be able to. We won't we who should be leading in the building will have such a compromised existences and health that we won't be able to build. And better is not possible when you have a whole swath of society that's suffering under the myriad impacts of pollution, and the very fact that without addressing pollution, then the whole planet suffers. And so how is it possible to build back better? Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. And Mr. Ali?
Yeah, my father was an engineer and a builder, and he used to often talk about foundations. And if you leave a foundation that is not properly built and that is not dealing with all the aspects of the weight that it has to hold, then it will crumble. So we have an opportunity to actually build strong foundations inside of our countries. We have the resources, we have the ingenuity, we have the information that's necessary. What we need to have is the will to prioritize, addressing our past mistakes. Sometimes we get anchored to the past and the egregious things that have happened. Well, yes, we should understand our history, but we should also be focused on the moment now and in the future, that we can actually make real change happen.
Well, I'm certain that we will hear many good specific solutions this afternoon on how to instill environmental justice in COVID response and economic recovery packages. So can you provide some perspectives on how we should think about environmental justice more broadly? How is it connected to racial justice and economic justice? Mr. Ali?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
I thought that was for Ms.
No. That's for you.
Well, no. So first, let's make sure that we're setting the table correctly. Environmental justice is an environmental issue, but it is also a transportation issue. It is a housing justice issue. It is a public health issue, and it is an economic justice issue, and a few other elements. So when we understand that, and we take a holistic approach to making positive change happen, then we find the intersection points for numbers of different people who have expertise and resources coming from different directions. So that is where I think that we should be starting. Lots of times we will silo these issues. And of course, committees have responsibility for certain items, but I will raise up the fact that at the Environmental Protection Agency, when I was there, I ran the interagency working group that had 17 federal agencies and a couple of White House offices that we could be utilizing at this time to actually make sure that, one, we're better understanding the impacts that are happening from COVID-19 on our most vulnerable communities, but also how do we begin to marshal both all the actions that you all have been moving forward on and the additional things that frontline communities and others have been asking for to actually holistically make our community stronger and more resilient.
Thank you so much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus, our subcommittee ranking member, for 5 minutes, please, to ask questions. Shimkus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's again great to be with all my colleagues and friends again. You know, we talk. It's important to talk about our past mistakes, but I also think it's important to talk about past successes, and that's why I'm glad that Mr. Hawkins is joining us today. Mr. Hawkins, you were a Senate Tax and Trade Counsel for Senator Scott and helped him draft the Opportunity Zone provisions in the 2017 tax cut law. My understanding is that these provisions had wide bipartisan support. Can you talk about that bipartisanship briefly?
Sure, absolutely. So the original Investing in Opportunity Act, which the Opportunity Zones provision in tax reform was based off of, that act had 44 House Democrats, 44 House Republicans. You know, by design, you know, we folks were brought onto the bill 2 by 2, and it also had 16 senators, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats. And again, it was led on the Senate side by Senators Booker and Scott, and on the House side by Representatives T. Berry and Kind. And so we saw that bipartisanship there.
What has been your what has been the reaction of local communities and governments to these provisions of the law?
We saw a great reaction. One huge difference between this policy and, you know, pretty much every other community development program that's developed to this point is that we put so much in the hands of local governors to select the zones, to select the areas that would benefit from this policy. And so, you know, the governors, you know, across the country, you know, rose to the challenge, and they chose zones, you know, based on non-binding criteria. We asked them to look for areas that had a great need, areas where there was great opportunity, and areas where they were mutually reinforcing federal, state, and local policy. And so, to a large extent, on the local level, you see local municipalities and state governments stepping up to produce complementary legislation to support the Opportunity Zones policy and really sort of put it on steroids, as it were. And so there's been great excitement on the state and local level.
And this included minority communities, tribal communities, and economically distressed communities, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So the opportunity zones that were chosen, you know, the basic criteria, you know, you had to have a poverty rate above 20%, and you know, a average median family income that's less than 80% of the state average, or if you're near a large city, then 80% of the metro average. So just in the basic criteria of what can be selected, you know, you're looking at distressed areas. But in what was ultimately selected, you know, you're looking at areas that are more heavily minority than normal. You're looking at areas that are lower median income than normal, and you're looking at areas that, you know, from a environmental standpoint, um, you know, encapsulate 30% of the nation's brownfields.
Right, and that's the convergence of what some of this committee of jurisdiction has done too, is that
Yeah.
brownfield reauthorization. So when you marry the two, and in my opening statement, I did mention the opportunity zones in the state of Illinois. We have 326 of them. Some of them in my congressional district. They are rural poor, but again, out of that 326, 180 are found in Cook County.
Yes.
Obviously, Illinois is a big state where we have Cook County and everything north of I-80, and then all the rest of us. So we look forward to that and trying to address the debate about how you rise people up. The best way to do that is jobs, empowering them. Then they can pay taxes to the local community and economic development, and that's been our approach. So as much as we want to take time about our failures of the past, I do think we should take a time out and say, the Opportunity Zones legislation in HR 1, married with brownfield redevelopment, is doing a lot to help these communities. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. There are a lot of problems that can be solved with a good job, problems that affect all of us. And so the goal of the policy is that everyone who has the ability to work have the opportunity to work.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Chairman Pallone of the Energy and Commerce Committee for 5 minutes. For questions, please.
Thank you, Chairman Tonko. And I am so excited and incredible optimism coming from these witnesses. I can't ask Mr. Hawkins a question because I have so many questions to ask of my other two witnesses. But I do want to say, Mr. Hawkins, first of all, I like the fact that you seem to have a picture of Teddy Roosevelt on the wall there, who's one of my favorite Republicans.
Yes. Yes.
You also mentioned my favorite son, presidential candidate and Senator Cory Booker. And finally, you mentioned the Brownfields program, which truly is, as Mr. Shimkus knows, bipartisan. And I was very fortunate to start the program with a bill when Christy Whitman, who was a Republican governor of New Jersey, was the EPA administrator. I worked on it with Paul Gilmore, and then we reauthorized it with John Shimkus. So thank you for all that, but I'm moving on to my other two witnesses for the questions. I wanted to say, Mr. Ali, when you talked about, you did that biblical reference to the oceans and rivers associated with justice and fairness. That was so wonderful from Amos, I think. I live at the Jersey Shore and I go down to the ocean sometimes at the end of the day. And I think of the ocean as a great equalizer. I really do. But at the same time, I know there's a lot of people, particularly minorities, that live near toxic waste sites, don't have the opportunity maybe to look at the ocean and enjoy it the way I do. And I also wanted to say to Jacqueline Patterson, thank you so much for stressing the need for legislation in the advent of what we face today, that we have to concentrate on what we can do legislatively because we're legislators. So my questions are about legislation and also input from the community. As I think you know, and I'll ask both Mr. Ali and Ms. Patterson, we introduced in the HEROES Act, we had provisions to ensure access to affordable drinking water and to fund environmental justice grants. We also have been responding to environmental justice by putting these grants, which I mentioned before, in the HEROES Act for environmental justice communities. So I wanted to ask you, is this a good idea, what we've done? Are there other legislative initiatives that we should try to initiate? And then secondly, impact from the communities. I'm critical of President Trump because he has done all these things to circumvent NEPA and cut funding for impacted communities and not enforce environmental regulations. And some of that is going to make it more difficult for those communities to have input into decision making. We have the right to know. Senator Lautenberg always talked about the right to know. We have tag grants. So my question is, legislation, what should we be doing? And to have more input in the community and how, some of these Trump actions are circumventing NEPA and making it more difficult for the communities to be heard, if you will. I know I took up a lot of time, but if you could just answer those two questions about the legislation and getting input from the communities that might be limited now with Trump's actions. I'll start with Ms. Patterson.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yes, certainly there are a number of actions legislatively that we are putting forward. I think I mentioned the ones that you mentioned are definitely good in terms of provisions in the HEROES Act. And I specifically mentioned that I actually don't know whether this would be legislative or administrative, but I talked about the retirement of the coal debt that's being held by the rural electric co-ops, who are really suffering during these times, for sure, as their member owners have compromised livelihoods. Also, in not only in terms of not restoring the regulations that have been rolled back, but also strengthening those regulations because they were always compromised by struggles to to really have them be as strong as they should be. We also need to be making sure that we have. I know that in the HEROES Act, I believe there was a provision in terms of a moratorium on utility shutoffs. We also need to be thinking about how do we make sure that we are ensuring reducing energy burden and ensuring affordability of energy across the board, and what does that look like? And also making sure that we are moving away from subsidizing fossil fuel energy that is causing so much of the pollution that's harming the health and well-being of frontline communities, as well as the planet, which also causes harm as well. And then I would just say, because I want to yield space for other folks, is that we need to be focusing now. Hurricane season started last Monday. We need to be focusing on pre-disaster mitigation, because as this combines with the disaster that we're dealing with now with COVID-19, we need to be making sure that we have civil and human rights at the center of emergency management. We've seen past failures in that sense, and we've seen that come a long way, and we need to go further in terms of making sure that we have a new standard that goes beyond returning homes to pre-disaster states that are so challenging, whether it's from indoor air quality and otherwise, that we actually build back better, as we said earlier. So those are just a few examples. I'll yield the floor so other folks have a chance. Thank you.
And Ms. Patterson hit on the major items that we need to be focused on. I would share that one of the other things that we need to also continue to expand upon is natural infrastructure. There are literally millions of jobs from a CCC type of paradigm that we could institute to actually help our country get back to work. So that's one of the areas. The other one is around food deserts and food insecurity that we find in many of our communities of color and lower wealth white communities. So we need to also be focused there because we have to have a healthy population. We talk a lot about jobs. Well, if somebody's not healthy, they're not going to be able to work efficiently and effectively. So we got to do that. And then there's one that sometimes probably makes people a little nervous, but I have to share it anyway. We need to have stronger enforcement where needed. And here's the interesting dynamic that we find.
Wait, we're going to have to, I think we're done with the 5 minutes there. Right? I'm sorry to cut you off. Maybe we can catch you in the next round of questioning. Next, we recognize Mr. Walden, ranking member of the full Committee of Energy and Commerce, for 5 minutes for questions, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Tonko, and thanks again to all of our witnesses for your presentations, your answers to questions. Really helpful, especially for those of us out here in the West. Where, by the way, it's pouring rain today, and so anyway, we're glad you're here. I want to say a couple of things before we get into the questions on the NEPA reform. As somebody that represents a district where over 55% of the landmass is controlled by the federal government. I've got a tiny little rural impoverished community, literally with probably 24 people in it, that took more than 3 years to go through the NEPA process to plant 4 power poles so they could finally get 3-phase power into this low-income rural part of my district. They had to put those power poles on BLM land, and it took them 3 years to go through a process. NEPA was never intended to cause that kind of delay. And so I'm glad they're making some reforms in NEPA. And I also want to say the Trump administration, frankly, and the economic policies that they put in place have given us, prior to COVID, the strongest economy and the lowest unemployment for every sector of America's economy we've seen. And so I think good paying jobs, low cost energy put America back on its feet. And unfortunately, we had to shut everything down with COVID, as did everybody across the globe. I want to ask Mr. Hawkins about the Opportunity Zones program. You've done a lot of work in this space. I think it's done a lot of good. There has been some criticism in the press, however, that the program just benefits wealthy real estate investors and doesn't really help those in need. And I'd love to get your take on that.
Sure. And so, the policy primarily supports 2 different types of projects. You have real estate projects, and then you have operating businesses. And so what we found is once we pass the Opportunity Zone provision, from a implementation standpoint, the rules that govern real estate were produced much more quickly than the rules that govern operating businesses.
All
And
right.
that's because it's a little bit simpler, right? Real estate is all located within the census tract. All of the income comes from within the census tract, et cetera. And so because those regulations were out first, the real estate projects were the first to take off. They're kind of, again, that low hanging fruit. And, and again, all of these are beneficial. Um, the real sort of meat of the program, where the real long-term job creation comes, is with those operating businesses developing down the line. And so, we don't have a transparency and reporting bill that gives us a very clear look into the types of businesses that are created and the direct job creation within the zones. And so that kind of hinders us. So you have a lot of folks in the media who are kind of speculating. They know that, you can use the policy to turn $1 into $10, and they know rich people have capital gains. So they just sort of speculate that it's only benefiting rich people, but that's not the case.
All right. So tell me what you're seeing actually happen on the ground then in these real estate opportunity zone agreements. Give us an example or two.
Absolutely. So, we have members that specialize in things like luxury hotels, right? But they had a heart for impact even before opportunity zones were passed into law.
All right.
So, one of our charter member, in fact, has a policy where they do one luxury hotel, one affordable housing facility, one luxury hotel, one affordable housing facility. And so they have that balanced portfolio in order to get the best out of the policy, while at the same time doing good. And that same charter member has actually been partnering with, organizations like Chicanos por la Causa and the Urban League and others to sort of reproduce this model across the country in areas that have less sort of on the ground knowledge of the community. So that makes sure that the development that occurs is developing in line and in a way that's going to have a positive impact on that local community.
All right. I see my time's expired. I want to thank again all of our witnesses for your energy, your presentations today. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Peters for 5 minutes, please. Are you unmute, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming out today and joining us. I want to thank Mr. Ali for coming back. Last time we met was before this committee. We were discussing challenges facing communities on the front line of climate change, and we talked about environmental and health risks that disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income communities. We talked about coastal floods forcing planned relocations in Louisiana and Alaska, and about exposure to air pollution, increasing the risk of asthma attacks in communities of color. And today, of course, we're talking about the same disparities following the same frontline communities, and this time in the context of an infectious disease pandemic. Growing data show the extent to which COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting poor and minority communities. Poor air quality in these communities is strongly associated with a higher risk of death from COVID-19. And a recent Harvard study shows that the long-term exposure to air pollution, such as particulate matter and ozone and other hazardous air pollutants, leads to a large increase in COVID-19 cases and related deaths. So weakening clean air protections and rolling back regulatory projections again threatens to cost more lives. The most vulnerable Americans are the hardest hit by climate change, and to right these environmental injustices, we have to prepare our state, tribal, local, and territorial public agencies to adapt to an already changed climate. And we also talk often about what we spend on adapting to climate change that we know is going to happen. But I think we also need to recognize that anything we do to mitigate climate change, because climate change has the biggest negative effect on these disadvantaged communities. Anything we do to mitigate climate change will have the greatest effect on and most benefit to those same communities. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions to Mr. Hawkins about some of the job losses, particularly in the context of clean energy. According to the latest analysis of clean energy job losses, we lost almost 600,000 clean energy jobs in April. And in your testimony, you described the important role that clean energy plays in opportunity zones. What role do you see for clean energy investments in the economic recovery?
Yes, well, I definitely appreciate that. So while the designated opportunity zones are have disproportionately high numbers of poverty and things along those lines, they've actually seen some real leadership on the clean energy side of things. And so when we look at particularly solar, the opportunity zones have 475, I believe.
That's great.
I was just double checking my testimony, but I believe 475, and I can.
Yeah, it's 475 solar installations producing more than 1 megawatt of activity, and 127 wind farms and 15 battery plants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And so we've seen that because the entire policy draws in innovation, right? And so we've seen a lot around clean energy. We've seen a lot around solar. We haven't seen as much on the wind side. But again, we're looking at $100 billion that'll come into these communities over the next 10 years. And what's important is that every business doesn't have to be necessarily organic to an opportunity zone. It can be a business that was, placed anywhere, and they can build a subsidiary in an opportunity zone. So what it does is it lowers the cost of capital for those clean energy projects. And when you put that and overlay that with some of the other work that you guys did, have done around clean energy and around, the various clean energy tax credits, those are mutually reinforcing to what you see in opportunity zones.
I'm gonna run out of time, but I just want to say I hope that our committee thinks about as we recover from this pandemic, investing in things that both create jobs and reduce carbon emissions. And I think that there are opportunities around that too. And finally, I just want to say to Mr. Walden, who told you that it was raining in the West, at least in areas in San Diego represented by Democrats, it's a sunny day here. And I yield back.
Okay, we're getting the updated weather reports from the West Coast. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Rogers, please, for 5 minutes, and I'll remind our representative to unmute. And 5 minutes is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Continuing from the West Coast. It's partly cloudy, partly sunny here. Anyway, it's good to be with all of you. I want to thank our panelists for your presentations and appreciate the focus on this important topic today. Certainly, our vulnerable communities have borne an unproportionate share of the current health and economic crisis. And I'm glad that we have an opportunity to discuss some specific steps as to what we can do to improve people's lives and to continue our pursuit for a more perfect union. I appreciated what Congressman Shimkus, the ranking member, had to say about reflecting on past mistakes, but also past successes as we seek to live up to our American ideals. And economic revitalization programs can have a significant impact on areas of the country that are experiencing economic stagnation, and especially in these former industrial areas. I've seen it in Eastern Washington. I've seen it in Spokane. And these areas can have a particular negative impact on both the community's health and economic potential. So cleaning up these areas has the positive impact of improving the environmental health of the community, along with the amazing potential of creating more jobs. And as others have mentioned, a job is so foundational to both addressing environmental issues in this case, but also improving people's health, providing housing, and creating that foundation for a better life. In Spokane, we've had an incredible amount of success and economic growth in the last decade. And part of it is due to some former industrial sites that have had tremendous economic development. EPA's Brownfields program has been an essential tool that Spokane has used to realize the economic benefits of these former industrial zones. So last Congress, this committee reauthorized the Brownfields program. It was led by Mr. McKinley, and I'm proud of the bipartisan support of this important program. The opportunity zones that have been discussed this morning, including the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, another tool that is being used to encourage these distressed communities and encourage the investment that we need so that we can transform these areas into more prosperous and more healthy areas. So Mr. Hawkins, first I want to thank you for your work developing the Opportunity Zones program during your time with Senator Scott. As you know, the members on this panel are proud of what EPA's Brownfields program and related technical assistance can do to prepare communities for economic development. I just wanted you to describe again how many of the opportunity zones also overlap with brownfield sites, and just talk to the significance of this overlap.
Sure, sure. So, of the 151 communities that, that have been designated for those remediation funds, for that 65 million plus, 118 of those are also overlapping opportunity zones. And so folks will be able to leverage both, and we look at that focus, that's actually part of an initiative. The White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council was structured to bend every resource of the federal government from a community development perspective to sort of, you could look at it as favor opportunity zones. So when you're looking at permitting, when you're looking at anything, you go to the top of the stack if you're in an opportunity zone. And the point is to leverage the policy as much as possible. And it's we see it with brownfield remediation, we see it with other areas, the FCC and rural broadband, and it's just very exciting.
How does that track with what your initial prediction was?
Well, again, we are on track, to get the funds in. The real focus, a focus for you all on Capitol Hill and a focus for state and local governments is not so much making sure the capital goes in. The levers of the policy guarantee that. We just have to make sure that the capital benefits the existing residents of distressed communities, and so far it seems to be.
The gentlelady yields back, I believe. And the chair now recognizes Representative Barragan for 5 minutes, please. Please unmute.
Thank you, Chair Tonko. This is a very timely hearing given the protests calling attention to the systematic racism in our country. Systematic racism is widespread and it includes housing and environmental policies that have disproportionately impacted our Black and Brown communities. And an important part of achieving racial justice is addressing environmental justice. Black and Brown communities in my district have suffered greatly from the current pandemic. Our air pollution levels are among the worst in the country, which has caused high rates of asthma and respiratory diseases. Those elements have been shown to make COVID-19 deadlier to those who have them because of how the infection attacks the lungs and the respiratory system. This makes communities in my district more vulnerable to the coronavirus. It's a pre-existing health and environmental crisis made worse by the coronavirus. So we need action. There's been a lot of talk about opportunity zones. I supported opportunity zones to help create jobs. But that's not going to help our Black and Brown communities that have to live in these communities right next to air pollution. So, Mr. Ali, one of the legacies of redlining, the government sanctioned denial of home loans and insurance to communities of color, is that our housing is disproportionately located near polluting industries. For example, oil refineries in my district. Can you talk about how the systematic racism from our housing policy is part of the reason our communities are disproportionately exposed to air pollution and solutions we can implement to overcome this?
Most definitely. You know, historically, we have, with our housing stock, move people into certain locations, into our sacrifice zones. And then, you know, many of the negative things were brought in, were attracted to these places because of the disinvestments that were actually going on in those spaces. So as you said, we can travel across the country and you can find where certain actions in relationship to bad housing practices have put people's lives in danger. Whether we're talking about, as Ms. Patterson raised earlier, Cancer Alley there in Louisiana, running between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. If you look at folks in North Carolina and Princeville, founded by freed slaves and moved into certain areas, and then the disinvestment. So there you have folks who've been hit by major hurricanes back to back and can't rebuild. If you go down to South Carolina, to near the Little Petey River that's there, you actually have seniors of color, and lower wealth white communities also, who, because of the housing stock that they've been in and placed in, they're in greater danger. And unfortunately, also now we have these processes in place where they can't even rebuild their homes. They have to lift them up a certain distance to meet code, but there's no resources to help these seniors to actually be able to do that. We can literally travel around the country and see how redlining, restrictive covenants, and a number of things have actually pushed people of color and sometimes lower wealth communities, but primarily folks of color, into these areas, and then all of the negatives that come with that.
Well, thank you. Ms. Patterson, thank you for all your work with the NAACP combating environmental racism in our country. Many years ago, as a college student, I was an intern at the Washington Bureau with Hillary Shelton there fighting racial health disparities. So I appreciate all the work that your organization does on that issue, on civil rights issues across the country. We have seen newly published studies linking the exposure to particulate matter pollution to an increase in deaths from coronavirus. Ms. Patterson, what investments can we be making in our Black and Brown communities to reduce this pollutant? And do you believe that includes addressing the pollution that comes from vehicles?
Thank you so much. Absolutely. And I appreciate your service with the Washington Bureau. So yes, absolutely. In terms of reducing pollution from vehicles, including one of the projects we're working on is our Transit Equity, Clean Air, Healthy Communities Initiative, which really looks to do just that by working on passing ordinances to transition bus and truck fleets to electrification to remove that hazard from communities. We also need much stronger, again, air pollution standards from the Clean Air Act and its rulemaking. And also we're working on advancing clean air ordinances at the local level so that whether it's refineries or coal-fired power plants or other types of production plants are not there causing, emitting those pollutants. We also need to really be thinking not just about what we're stopping, but what we're advancing. So in addition to advancing bus and truck electrification, we need to be thinking about building electrification, greater energy efficiency, and clean energy. And how do we invest in that transition as an alternative to the harmful ways that we are generating energy now, as well as shifting to zero waste, because we know that incinerators are also burning waste and putting PM 2.5 and other pollutants into the air. So thank you. Those are the types of investments I would recommend.
Well, thank you for your response. With respect to the investments in transportation, I just want to quickly mention, I've introduced the Climate Smart Ports Act to invest billions of dollars into reducing emissions in and around ports where we see a lot of communities of color live. and suffer from air pollution. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and we now recognize Representative McKinley for 5 minutes. Representative McKinley, just unmute, and you have your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, last November, this subcommittee held a similar hearing on challenges facing frontline communities as they transition away from fossil fuels. We highlighted towns like Welch, West Virginia, Gillette, Wyoming, Arlen, Kentucky, and Petersburg, Indiana, all of which depend on fossil fuels for their livelihood and existence. Now, 8 months later, let's revisit Welch in McDowell County. Welch is unique. It has a minority population, the largest in West Virginia, of 35% minority. It's now experiencing a poverty rate of 27%, and unemployment has grown to 15%. And this lack of jobs has led McDowell County to having the highest drug overdose rate among all the counties in America. In a conversation with the mayor of Welch last week, he implied that the repercussions of COVID create short-term problems, but the anti-fossil fuel agenda from the left is a long-term threat for communities like Welch and would completely destroy the economy of the city of Welch and the entire region. So, Mr. Chairman, tying air pollution to COVID-19, really? Seriously? It is a simplistic answer to a complicated question. Once again, you are taking advantage of a public health crisis to justify your party's agenda against fossil fuels. We shouldn't jump to conclusions. Some have advocated that pre-existing conditions such as hypertension and diabetes are linked to COVID-19. But a recent study from Oxford University has concluded otherwise. We've only been studying this issue for 5 months. I agree that this is a complicated situation, but we need more data. For example, Welch, McDowell County, with all its problems, has only experienced 6 cases of COVID and no deaths. So in the meantime, in lieu of villainizing fossil fuels, why aren't we researching and developing technologies to capture carbon emissions and provide a lifeline to distressed communities like Welch, Gillette, Harlan, and Petersburg? Now, listen, those communities are all hearing the same stories that you and I are hearing, that Biden has already said fossil fuels will have no part in his administration. Therefore, are frontline communities like Welch expendable? Are the people of Welch among the 10 to 15% of Americans that Biden thinks are not very good people? Are they the deplorables? Our frontline communities like Welch, with a heavy minority population, should not be collateral damage to your war on fossil fuels. We have a moral obligation to not write them off, but to help them. So, Mr. Hawkins, if I could to you, a question. Some will call fossil fuels pollution, but in West Virginia, we call them jobs. You helped author the legislation for opportunity zones to benefit frontline communities like Welch, but for whatever reason, it's not included in an opportunity zone in West Virginia. So my question to you is primarily how can we modify the opportunity zones? They're locked in for 10 years. How can we modify those opportunity zones so towns like Welch can benefit and prosper and diversify their economy?
What we would love is for Congress to first pass a transparency and reporting bill, because the initial legislation had provisions that would allow us to record the types of businesses, the amount of jobs created, and the locations of those jobs. That reporting will give us the data that we need to say, look, opportunity zones are working. They're serving the people we don't want to serve, and now it's time to expand them. Because we would love to give the governor of West Virginia the ability to designate an additional 10% of zones, let's say. So going from 25% designations to 35%. You know, in my state of Ohio, that'd be an additional 120 zones that could be designated. And so if we can get the data once, you know, first of all, to see that the policy is working, and then use that to enable legislation to expand the policy and allow additional zones to be designated, then we can pull those areas of West Virginia in that could benefit from the policy and that could benefit from the jobs that'll be created.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative McEachin for 5 minutes, please. And unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As our nation continues to navigate the crisis caused by, in some cases, exacerbated by COVID-19, I cannot think of a more important time to be working together to ensure that environmental justice communities are centered in our work. I want to thank our witnesses for their time and their expertise. I've had occasion to work with both of them over the past few years, and I'm deeply gratified by their leadership and their commitment to equity and justice. The COVID-19 pandemic is harming communities of color disproportionately. The burden of pollution in these communities is a big part of the reason. The pandemic is another burden accumulating on top of pollution in our air, lead in our water, and carcinogens in our soil. Many of our environmental laws call for the protection of vulnerable or high-risk populations, but no one can look at the disproportionate burden of disease in our country, including COVID-19, and say that we are protecting those communities. Now, this is a little bit off of what I had intended to ask in the first instance, but given the previous member's remarks, Ms. Patterson, do you care to comment on the assertions made by Mr. McKinley about Welch and their view of the leftist war on fossil fuels?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would more frame that as the frontline communities' quest for health and survival. And we have seen just how we put out a report called Fumes Across the Fence Line that talked about the extreme negative impacts of the oil and gas industry and refineries on our communities. We put out our cold-blooded report where we talked about how the Department of Labor's own statistics talks about the 76,000 coal miners who have died of black lung disease since 1968 as they toiled to create energy for our nation. So for us, we don't frame it as anything but really looking out for the health and well-being of our communities and our planet. And for us, we put together this group called the Black Labor Initiative on Just Transition, which includes groups like the United Mine Workers of America, the U.S. Steel Workers, and so forth, so that we could all come together and say, given the necessity of this transition away from fossil fuels that are harming communities and planet, how can we do this in a way where your livelihoods are maintained and where you are, and not in the fossil fuel industry, but in an industry that really maintains your pensions, your health care, and the income that you need to move forward. So that's the kind of conversation that we would like to be having, so that we can so we have all. We have energy, we have the income and livelihoods that people need, and we have health and well-being for communities, and we have the survival of the planet. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Patterson. Let me just follow up again with one more question. Are you essentially saying that clean air and clean water and a greening of our economy actually equals good paying jobs?
That is exactly what I'm saying. We know from past statistics that the solar industry is in the top 10 growing industries in our country. Wind turbine technicians is the #1 fastest growing profession in our country. And we also know that we've seen where economic well-being can flourish in the new energy economy. And we can actually have a concentration of wealth building and ownership at the community level, so that all can thrive as opposed to a wealthy few.
Thank you. Mr. Ali, I just have a minute left, and I apologize to you for that, but can you help us understand how we can ensure that communities of color are actually at the table when we're dealing with standards being set and permits being issued.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of opportunities, whether it's in our public comment periods and making sure that those are open and transparent and that they are handled in a way that is actually inviting of people's participation and the knowledge that they bring. We can also make sure that both in our on the federal level and on the state level, that we are really truly engaging in an authentic and transparent way with folks as we are framing out really what will either be a positive or negative in their lives. We have a number of opportunities to really engage with frontline communities to make real change happen.
Thank you. I appreciate it, my friend. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Johnson for 5 minutes of questioning, and please unmute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I get into my questions, let me give another warm welcome to my fellow Buckeye, Shay Hawkins from Cleveland. Shay, we appreciate you being here today and offering your very important perspective on these issues. You are most welcome. You know, bringing new investment to economically distressed communities is key to improving the quality of life for local residents and weathering economic disruptions like we've seen with the shuttering of much of our economy as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In my district in eastern and southeastern Ohio, we've been blessed with an oil and gas boom, which has provided a variety of good paying jobs for thousands of blue collar workers. The American energy renaissance has benefited millions of families across the country and across all socioeconomic levels. In fact, according to the American Petroleum Institute, by the year 2030, over 32% of the oil and gas workforce across the country, over 400,000 workers, will be from members of minority communities. But today, I want to focus on another promising development, helping underserved communities. And Mr. Hawkins is an expert on this. You've already heard him speak on it a little bit. And I'm talking about returning to opportunity zones, which I was pleased to support as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. While utilizing opportunity zones can be an effective way to address financial and social challenges in urban areas like Cleveland, they can also improve economic conditions in historically distressed rural areas like Appalachia, where I live. Mr. Hawkins, I understand there was over $10 billion raised into opportunity funds as of March 2020. What role do you see opportunity zones playing in the economic recovery from the COVID-19 lockdown?
I think they're going to play a critical role, an absolutely critical role. And the reason is because these communities, you know, whether they be urban opportunity zones or whether they be rural opportunity zones, these areas are always the first to get hit when we go into a recession, and they're hit the hardest, and they're always the last to recover. And so the difference between past recessions and the economic disruption that we're seeing from COVID-19 is that in previous recessions, we did not have opportunity zones. Opportunity zones aren't a panacea, but they are a very sharp tool in the community development toolbox.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Let me change the direction for just a second, because we've got 18 opportunity zones in my district alone in Ohio. So how large do you expect the investment potential to be in these opportunity zones? Because we need them where I live.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, you know, we've got 10.8 billion, I believe, raised as of April 30th. And Secretary Mnuchin estimates that $100 billion will come into these zones over the next 10 years. And so, you know, we're excited. You know, the rural zones provide great opportunities for things like rural broadband, things like clean technology, you know, and that's what we've been seeing. And we've been seeing it areas that are as rural as northern Alaska. So, you know, we are very excited to see what develops.
Okay. Are there any outstanding, as we've seen the implementation of the opportunity zones, are there any outstanding regulations that are needed to in connection with opportunity zones to make them work more effectively?
Yes, absolutely. The initial Investing in Opportunity Act included reporting and transparency provisions. And so because of parliamentary reasons, we had to strip those out. We passed it in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But there is a bill right now on the Senate side that Senator Scott and Senator Sinema, along with Chairman Grassley, introduced to add those reporting and transparency requirements back. And so we would love to introduce a version of that on the House side and to have you guys get it passed.
All right. Well, thank you. I had some other questions, but I'll submit those for the record. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Hawkins.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Blunt Rochester for 5 minutes for questions. And Representative, unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, thank you so much for your time. As we are having this hearing, George Floyd is being laid to rest in his final ceremony. And I think it is only fitting that as we talk about COVID-19, a disease that is a respiratory one, and to link it to all of the different issues that we've talked about here, just even the ability to be able to breathe is something that is heavy on my heart. And I have prepared remarks, and I'm a little bit off script here as well, because I'm the kind of person, as many of you know, I like to celebrate our successes. But I feel that at this moment, part of what each of us individually and collectively have to do is hold up a mirror to ourselves and say, what can we do differently? And I appreciate this hearing because I think it is shining a light, just like COVID-19 has magnified the inequities that we already knew existed in our society. And so as we move forward, I appreciated Mr. Walden's comments as well. I hope that we will hold up an individual mirror as well as the collective mirror, and maybe put aside some of even the phrases and terms that we use to politicize things, because what we're experiencing right now is something different. And like I said, I have remarks here that really just talk about the fact that racism and injustice are built into the foundation, as Mr. Ali said. And it's not just about the foundation crumbling and the house being destroyed. It's about the fact that sometimes you can have a shaky foundation and the house stays the same, but you continue to do repairs and upkeep, and it becomes a money pit. And until we start dealing with root issues, until we start really having courageous conversations with each other, we will continue to have a money pit where we're just dumping money into programs. And it's not that these individual programs aren't great, but it has to be systemic, and we have to see outcomes. We have to see real outcomes. And so those communities that we call vulnerable, those communities that we call distressed, I call them superhuman, that people are even still existing when they're placed next to toxic sites, when they don't have food and healthcare and transportation. And so I am proud to be a member of this committee because we have the ability to do incredible things. And I'm looking forward to that. I've got questions here, and I'm going to try to go very quickly, but I want to hold a mirror to myself and all of us to commit, separate and apart from these hearings, that we're going to work together to change the outcomes that we're seeing. To George Floyd and his family, my prayers. Studies show that there is a disproportionate and cumulative impact that pollution has had on communities of color and, as Mr. Ali calls, low wealth and rural communities as well. And that we're seeing the staggering mortality rates from COVID-19 on those communities. And in the 1 minute I have left, Mr. Ali, if you could talk a little bit about how more data and better data would be helpful. We know that there are monitoring systems that have either not been updated or are not working. We've written to Administrator Wheeler, and I thank those who signed on to that letter. But if you could talk a little bit about the use of data that would help fence line communities particularly.
Yes, thank you, Representative. I mean, that is one of the critical elements that we need. When I first started working on these issues, I remember walking down the hallways of EPA, and there were two folks who were in front of me, and they said, I don't know why we're going to this meeting on environmental equities, because what these people are sharing can't possibly be true. So if you're just dealing with the narratives, the stories that are incredibly important from frontline communities, without being able to lock that down with the data, then people can make those types of statements. That was over 25 years ago. Today, we have to make sure that the monitors are in the right locations, that the information that is coming out of that is accessible both to regulators, to policymakers, but also to frontline communities. We also have to, as we shared earlier, we need to make sure that we're also getting the data that needs to exist in relationship to COVID-19, that is closely aligned with these hotspots that we find across the country. When we don't do that, then it's easy for folks to say, well, that sounds like a story that you're telling instead of something that is rooted in facts. And as the agency has kind of moved away from capturing the relevant data, we have to move back in that direction so that we can anchor everything in facts.
Thank you. And Ms. Patterson, I have a question for you that we will ask afterwards. And we would like to submit the letter to Administrator Wheeler for the record. And again, to my colleagues, together, let's do this together. I yield back.
Good message, Congresswoman. And the gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Flores for 5 minutes for questions, please. And please unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the witnesses for joining us today. I would encourage us to reassess having these online hearings. I think that Congress is an essential service and that the American people would be better served by us doing this in person. Mr. Hawkins, I have a couple of questions for you. I'd like to expand the opportunity zone discussion and talk a little bit about rural communities. We've all heard today that stronger economic employment opportunities can lead to numerous other benefits, such as environmental protections, healthcare, education, emergency services, greater tax base, and on and on. Opportunity zones were created by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and the predecessor to that was the work that you and Senator Scott had done. They were done to stimulate economic development and job creation by incentivizing long-term investments in low-income, often overlooked neighborhoods and communities. And these zones also overlap often with what some call environmental justice communities. Right. Today, there are more than 8,760 of these designated qualified opportunity zones. They're located in the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 United States territories. So question one is this: can you tell me roughly how many or what percentage of these opportunity zones are in rural areas? And can you also provide a few examples of successful active projects that are underway today?
Sure. So about 23% of the zones that were designated would fall into the category of rural areas. And then the remainder are in urban areas or what we call suburban areas. Suburban areas being about 10% and then the remainder being in urban areas. And so there's a significant potential impact there. When we look at concrete examples of some of the things that we've seen in urban areas, in rural areas. We can look to rural broadband, and I can look to one of my members who's been operating to expand rural broadband in rural Alaska. And so, as you can imagine, because of the terrain in Alaska, it's very difficult to get fiber penetrated into the interior of the state. But Opportunity Zones has lowered the cost of capital to the point where it's made it feasible. So one of our members, along with their existing investors, along with an opportunity fund that focuses on broadband, and along with an additional support from one of the tribal corporations, has been expanding rural broadband in Alaska and laying that fiber. And so if you can lay the fiber up there and expand rural broadband in Alaska, then you can expand it anywhere.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad you brought up rural broadband. Are there any other specific obstacles to broadband internet access that aren't being addressed today by statute or by the Opportunity Zone legislation that we passed earlier?
Well, one of the things that we've seen, again, with that White House Revitalization and Opportunity Council, some of those resources that have been bent to favor opportunity zones have included a $26 billion fund to support rural broadband at the FCC. And so we've seen that. And then we've also seen some sort of interesting legislation out there to possibly create gigabit opportunity zones, right? That are focused on building out rural broadband infrastructure, along the same concept of traditional opportunity zones.
Okay. And then lastly, back to rural opportunity zones writ large, are there any other particular obstacles to robust investment in those rural zones? And if so, what are they?
So we haven't identified any particular obstacles. One thing from a regulatory standpoint, the regulations from Treasury that would govern operating businesses took longer to come out than those that would cover real estate. So operating businesses are what you're really going to see developing in the rural areas. And so we had those final regulations completed as of December 2019.
Okay.
So now that those regulations are out, that was the primary obstacle that we saw to operating business development in rural areas. And so we're just looking forward to seeing the money flow.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Soto for 5 minutes of questioning. And Representative Soto, please unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Climate change, polluted air and water, social injustice, and COVID-19, they're all interrelated. As COVID-19 swept across our nation, President Trump hid the truth from the American people. He politicized the issue, and worst of all, he did nothing for weeks. From January through February and early March, as the coronavirus swept across our nation, President Trump's failed COVID-19 response has greatly contributed to the death of over 113,000 Americans, over 2 million Americans contracting the virus as well. President Trump's failed COVID-19 response also left 40 million Americans seeking unemployment and the worst economic recession since the Great Depression. Now add his dismal failure to protect clean air and water, and he's created the perfect disaster for the American people. This especially affects frontline communities of color and low-income communities. And as my home state of Florida faces another dangerous hurricane season, rising seas, even a Miami seawall of 13 feet high, we know that we have to do something. In Central Florida, in my home area of Florida's 9th Congressional District, we see that in the Hispanic community, in our community, higher cases because we have many essential workers in Osceola County, which is why we need to pass the HEROES Act to help provide hazard pay for these essential workers. In the African American communities in Polk County in our district, we saw higher levels of deaths in addition to higher level of cases among Hispanics. And also we saw similar trends in poor rural Anglo communities in the district. My question to Ms. Patterson and Mr. Ali, some folks want us to study more, to delay more before enacting environmental justice reforms. Do we have enough data on the effect of air pollution on COVID-19 to move forward with certain environmental justice reforms already? If so, what would they be? To both Mr. Ali and Ms. Patterson.
I'll let Mr. Ali go first. Thank you.
We have more than enough data. So let me just give a quick historical point for folks who may not know. In 1992, John Lewis, esteemed member with your family there, actually introduced the first piece of environmental justice legislation, reintroduced it in 1993, and I believe tried also in 1994. And at that time, he was trying to put a spotlight on the hot spots that exist around the country so that we could then make the investments that were necessary, and also make sure that we not only the investments, that we also had the legislation that would help to make sure that that didn't happen in the future. So now we are, 28 years later. During that time, there have been a number of institutions that have done all kinds of critical research, both public health organizations, environmental organizations, and a number of others that have pinpointed the fact of the impacts that are happening from this pollution and the disproportionate impact on communities of color, lower wealth communities, and on indigenous lands. So it's not a matter of being able to have to prove any of this anymore. The question is, are we willing to prioritize these communities to address both the past impacts and also, as many of you have been sharing, think critically about how do we help these communities also be able to rebuild? I appreciate the conversation that is going on about the opportunity zones. I have my own set of questions that I'm always curious about are they uplifting people? Are they causing gentrification? A number of other things. And if those can be answered, then that's fantastic. But we should also be focused on the fact that frontline communities have been doing their own revitalizing of vulnerable communities. And I hope this committee, when the time is right, that we actually go out and visit firsthand these communities to see how they've actually been able to transform their communities, to be able to create jobs, to be able to create healthy housing, to be able to create new transportation.
Mr. Ali, my time's limited, so I want to turn to Ms. Patterson. Do you believe boosting fossil fuel and chemical production in communities of color and low-income communities is in the long-term best interest of those communities?
Did you say boosting?
If you boosting fossil fuel and chemical production industries, is that in the best interest of low-income and community of color communities?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, just didn't catch that one word. No, I do not. Studies, experiences have all shown how in communities that are exposed to fossil fuel pollution from coal to oil and gas and so forth, have shown the myriad and public health challenges that those communities face. So it definitely isn't in their long-term interest, as well as when we turn on the other side and see the connection between fossil fuel emissions and climate change, that we know that the climate change disproportionately impacts those communities, from the sea level rise you talked about and the displacement that they face, to the disaster impacts that we saw in Hurricane Katrina and beyond, to the shifts in agricultural yields when these communities are already food insecure and suffer the many health challenges as a result. So in every way, and not to mention the actual harms to the workers in those industries, with 76,000 coal miners dying of black and counting, dying of black lung disease since 1968, and we know the many accidents and fatalities that happen that are tied to the fossil fuel industry. So, so no, in no way is it in the best interest of communities of color and frontline communities. Thank you for asking.
Thanks, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Mullen for 5 minutes for questions, and Representative, unmute, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for this opportunity. I gotta address something real quick, and I want to talk to Mr. Hawkins about opportunity zones. But the idea of these meetings is to make sure we try to leave politics out of it as much as possible. I mean, if we're really going to have a hearing that's going to be able to move the ball forward and try to advance opportunities for all of our constituents, then we drag in politics like our colleague from Florida just did. It's absolutely absurd for blaming the president for everything. If I'm not mistaken, it was not too long ago that I believe our colleague from Florida was trying to limit innovation in pharmaceuticals. That was before COVID, obviously. And now we're going to walk down this path and you're going to blame him for everything. Guys, as a committee, we're better than this. Our committee has had a long history of trying to do bipartisanship. And there's no way we can have bipartisanship if we continue to blame everybody for it. It doesn't make any difference. We're in a pandemic. Let's figure out a way to move the ball forward. I don't think any of us are intentionally trying to hurt anybody. But we all have unique challenges in our district, and my district is no different. I mean, one thing that has been exposed in my district is broadband. I have a very rural district. In fact, just recently, the only reason why I'm able to even be on this hearing is because I got internet at my house. Until just recently, that didn't exist. When I say I live in the middle of nowhere, I truly do. And when we start talking about opportunity zones, we need to pay attention to that. Mr. Hawkins, that's what I was wanting to talk to you about a little bit. I know you've had experience working inside Indian country to some degree, but all my district is Indian country. I'm in Oklahoma.
Yes.
So when we start looking at opportunity zones in particular, how can broadband be part of that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes to the flexibility that's built into the policy itself. So the way the policy works is every dollar doesn't necessarily have to be derived from within the opportunity zone in order for the company in the opportunity zone to derive the tax benefit. So this is just to say that as long as the nucleus of the operation, the employees, the leaders of the company, the management team, et cetera, as long as they are located in the zone and the jobs are created in the zone, the actual infrastructure can spread out outside the zone because it's natural, it's expected that the revenues are going to come from outside of the distressed area.
And
to say that it's particularly set up to lay fiber over a broad geography and still be able to benefit from that lower cost of capital.
And in opportunity zones, we talk about jobs too, because with technology also comes job opportunities.
Yes.
And in rural parts of the area, which is why opportunity zones were existed, it was helped to spur along those jobs. Being in rural America, for a lot of young people, the only opportunity for them to have a really good paying job is to move. And we don't want that to happen.
Right.
I want my kids to live out on the ranch. I want my kids to live around us. I've got 6 of them, so one of these days I'm going to have a handful of grandkids too.
There it is.
And yeah, absolutely. And we want to keep that that family unit close, but opportunity zones can, and I'm assuming your opinion, can help create those jobs that are good, sustainable, long-paying jobs too, right?
Absolutely. They not only create jobs from the companies that come, but again, as you look at things like rural broadband being built out, that provides the technological connection with the rest of the world that allow people to stay put and still do what they need to do. It also helps in terms of things like telehealth. So telehealth is something that's compromised if you don't have a robust broadband infrastructure, and opportunity zones can be a key part of building that infrastructure out.
Thank you. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative DeGette for 5 minutes, and
Thank you.
You did unmute. Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Some of you on this subcommittee have heard me talk about the Suncor refinery, which is adjacent to the Denver communities of Globeville and Elyria, Swansea, which have a long-standing pattern of air quality violations and frankly putting the surrounding community at health risk. And just for an example, in a 6-month period last year, the company violated key emissions limits nearly 3,000 times. sometimes for more than a week in a row. Now, significantly, Swansea, Elyria, and Globeville have a predominantly Latino population, where even before the COVID crisis, some of my colleagues, Representative Berrigan, were talking about issues like this. A third of the residents live below poverty level, and they also have food insecurity. So I don't think anybody will be surprised, given the testimony we heard today, that these communities have also been one of the areas hardest hit by the coronavirus. Ms. Patterson, I want to ask you, could you elaborate about how social and environmental injustices are compounded by COVID-19 in environmental justice communities like Swansea, Elyria?
Certainly. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah. So unfortunately, when we have a situation where communities are already facing food insecurity, and therefore that contributes to these poor health conditions, that we're already facing the level of pollution that we talked about that leads to poor health conditions, as well as ties to other challenges around whether it's kids being out of school on poor air quality days, or kids being in school and having a hard time paying attention because of the pollutants that they're exposed to. And then you add a pandemic on top of it all. So it's just the cumulative and compounded social, educational, and health factors, not to mention even the economic, certainly we see how the COVID-19 has affected the economy in general, but even before that, when kids are out of school and people have to stay home with their kids, then their financial well-being suffers. And then
I hate to stop you. I have a couple more questions, and it just compounds it, which is why we see the infection rates and the death rates higher in communities of color and in at-risk communities. And also, Ms. Blunt Rochester talked about the air quality monitoring stations being down. And in some places, the Trump administration is not even enforcing the laws. So many of us have been trying to raise maximum fines for air quality violation, like with Suncor. And we've also been trying to require robust community level air toxins. Now, Mr. Ali, something that I think you could tell us about is how important enforcement of these environmental laws would be towards protecting health in these communities.
Yeah, enforcement is really interesting, especially the time we're in. We pump huge amounts of money into enforcement and policing of Black and brown communities. But when it comes to enforcing those same industries that are there for some reason, we want to push back against that. And I've never been real clear why we do that. Well, I do have some ideas.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we know that there has been less enforcement actions happening over the last few years. We also know that there are less inspectors going out, and that creates a very dangerous scenario, especially for our most vulnerable communities. So I believe in human nature and the goodness that exists there, and I hope that most businesses and industries will do the right thing. But we know through history that there have been some who have not, who have been significant non-compliers, and we have to make sure that there is a cop on the job, if you want to label it that way, to make sure that people are doing the right thing.
Thank you. And Mr. Hawkins, I want to say to you, I really appreciate your work over many years on issues like opportunity zones and brownfields. Way back in the midst of times, I actually the brownfields bill in Colorado, which led to thousands of sites being cleaned up. But here's the thing, and I think you'll agree with this. Without robust enforcement of environmental laws, you're not going to clean up the air in these communities just with opportunity zones and brownfields. It can help, but you have to have enforcement of the laws. Wouldn't you agree with that?
That sounds reasonable.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Great hearing, and I yield back.
Okay, the gentlelady yields back in. You're most welcome. We now recognize Representative Carter for 5 minutes for questioning. And please unmute, Representative.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of our speakers for being here. We appreciate your participation. I want to start off by saying something about the EPA because I think it's been somewhat misrepresented about their actions during the COVID-19 pandemic. The EPA has continued to enforce our nation's environmental laws and work with the federal, state, and the tribal communities. So, you know, their temporary policy has responded to inquiries from the states, and many of them with stay-at-home orders trying to regulate the community in those states, trying to protect its employees from the viruses. The policy lets the agency prioritize its resources to respond to acute risk and immense threats. So again, under the temporary policy, no one's excused from exceeding pollution limitations, and the only major change is that the EPA is not seeking penalties for noncompliance related to routine monitoring and reporting requirements. You know, over 40 states have adopted COVID-19 related enforcement discretion, including agencies in New York and New Jersey. That's all. I say all that to say that the EPA and the environmental regulations continue to be enforced and the EPA's work continues. So I just want to set the record straight on that before we go any further. Mr. Hawkins, I really do appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the work that you've done, particularly on these opportunity zones. You know, one of the things that we've discovered during this pandemic is that we are too dependent on foreign countries, particularly China, for some of our pharmaceutical needs, our pharmaceutical manufacturing. And this is similar to what we experienced back in the late 70s when we realized that we were too dependent on the Middle East for our energy needs, and we realized we needed to have energy independence, and we achieved that. We realize now that we need to have pharmaceutical independence. Too much of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are coming from other countries, particularly China. One of the bills that I've introduced is legislation that will incentivize these companies to come back to America. And I'm actually working with Senator Scott and utilizing these opportunity zones as a tax incentive for these companies to come back and invest in our communities like this. Is this what the intent of the opportunity zones were, and to create jobs like this?
Yes, absolutely. And there's so much that's being done abroad that can be done, in these distressed communities. Just a couple quick examples. One, Puerto Rico is obviously, we had bipartisan legislation just after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in the first spending bill in February, bipartisan legislation that allowed Puerto Rico to designate 100% of their distressed census tracts as opportunity zones. As you know, Puerto Rico is a major hub for pharmaceutical development. And so we have one of our members there that's specifically starting a pharmaceutical subsidiary in order to bring back drug manufacturing that's currently done in China to Puerto Rico. So that's one area. We have another area, another member, I'm sorry, in South Carolina that is actually bringing machines from Taiwan to America that can build face masks. You literally put an input in the front of the machine. It spits out on the other end a packaged face mask that can wholesale for $2, retail for $5. And that's something that can be utilized because right now 85% of our face masks are made outside the country. And finally, we've got a member who creates small buildings out of shipping containers. They're in an opportunity zone. They build these buildings, they design them, and they can do 7-story buildings or individual buildings. Right now, they're building small scale, aligned with hospitals, small scale buildings where folks can do testing, and they're importing testing kits from South Korea. They can import them for $14 a kit, whereas normally it's $20 a kit, and the kits are much more accurate than the kits we use right now. So this policy can be used to bring a lot more manufacturing, distribution, and jobs back to the U.S.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Hawkins. And you know, the economic impact is obvious and very important, but it also has an environmental impact as well. And you've touched on that a number of times during this meeting, and I appreciate that. I'm sorry I've run out of time, but I want to point out that not only does it have an economic impact, it can have an environmental impact as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
You're most welcome. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the representative from California, Representative Matsui, for 5 minutes. And Representative, unmute, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and a huge thank you for all the witnesses that are with us today, taking the time to share with some of the stories that are happening on the ground in communities that are often overlooked despite the disproportionate burden they have to share. The pain experienced by Black, Brown, and low-income communities have come to the forefront of the national attention in recent weeks. We know that these communities have faced injustices for years with little cohesive action taken to right these wrongs. The hearing represents an important step in hearing stories, looking at the facts, and assessing what the most effective federal solutions will be ensuring a more just society for all. So let's first of all get some facts straight. About a month ago, the Harvard School of Public Health released a study highlighting how frontline communities and those living in the areas of the country with the worst air pollution are facing disproportionate risks of health complications and death from COVID-19. Mr. Ali, is it true that if you are non-white, you are more likely to live in an area with higher air pollution?
Yes.
Okay. Is it true that some studies have demonstrated that there is a link between living in areas with higher air pollution, specifically in fine particulate matter, and the mortality rate of COVID-19?
Yes.
Now, is it also true that a recent study determined that air pollution particles can act as vectors for the coronavirus in the air?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in spite of the significant findings of many of these studies, EPA is charging forward with a number of harmful deregulatory actions, including the Clean Air, Clean Cars rollback, and Administrator Wheeler's refusal to update the standard for regulating particulate matter pollution. Mr. Ali, how many lives are lost each year as a result of air pollution?
A minimum of 100,000.
Do you know what percentage of these deaths occur in communities of color or low-income communities?
I know there's disproportionately impacting. We need additional research to know the exact number.
Do you think the standards ought to be set higher?
Most definitely. And communities have asked us to do that.
Okay. Can you speak to the number of lives saved if we were to strengthen rather than maintain current particulate matter standards?
Tens of thousands of lives would be saved.
Okay, Mr. Ali, you worked at the Environmental Protection Agency for 24 years, specifically focusing on environmental justice. How can we strengthen EPA's Office of Environmental Justice to have the tools, authority, and funding it needs to better accomplish its mission?
We can elevate it to a national program office, just like we have the Office of Air and the Office of Water. Many of you have talked about brownfields and Superfund. We can make sure that that office is at that level. We can make sure that it has the staffing and expertise that's necessary. We can also make sure that we are honoring the interagency working group that runs through that office so that we can leverage the resources and expertise that exist in all of the other federal agencies also, so that we can achieve the goals that many folks on the call today have said that they'd like to see.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Patterson, you wrote in your article, Climate Change is a Civil Rights Issue, that the Black community tends to have a greater dependence on public transportation, that Black individuals are more likely to live in inner cities and are disproportionately affected by rises in home energy costs. I would imagine all of these factors play a role in how COVID-19 is impacting the Black community. Is that true? And if yes, how so?
Yes, that's absolutely true. Just in the early days of COVID-19, as they were restricting bus routes, I was driving on an essential trip to the grocery store and noticed a bus go by that was chock full of people in Washington, D.C., all African-American, none with masks on. And I wondered, about these essential workers whose whose work was deemed essential, that put them on that bus, but whose lives weren't deemed essential in terms of actually putting in the precautions that would protect them from the transmission of COVID-19 in that context.
Absolutely. I'm hearing more and more stories about polluting facilities moving into or near communities of color or low-income neighborhoods, with little fear of opposition or retaliation for the negative impacts they have on the people who live there. What would you say are some of the top factors preventing communities from being able to stop polluting facilities from moving into their neighborhoods?
Thank you. It definitely the inequities in terms of access to democracy, in terms that we see a lot in the way of decisions being swayed by the financial ways that folks are contributing either to campaigns or otherwise. And so we see where decision making happens in ways that are unfortunate. We also see where there aren't enough public engagement processes where people are actually part of decision making. So things happen to our communities disproportionately versus us actually having control. And one example I saw around the BP oil drilling disaster was when the waste from the toxic waste that included chemicals that were banned in 90 countries, Corexit, the one community that was able to fight back from having that toxic waste come to their community was the one community that was predominantly a white American community, and all the other communities that were host to that toxic waste were ones that had a higher than in the population of communities of color.
Certainly. Well, thank you very much for your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes Representative Duncan for 5 minutes for questions, and unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I think about the last hearing we had on the frontline communities and the one we're having today, I believe we need to be focused on creating the type of atmosphere that welcomes more income opportunities and brings investment into the communities that need it the most. When President Trump took office, the national unemployment rate at the time was 4.7%. The unemployment rate among African Americans was 8.1%, and it was 5.8% among Hispanic Americans. In February of this year, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic shutdowns, national employment was 3.5%. African American unemployment had dropped to 5.8%. Hispanic American unemployment was down to 4.4%. We got there by opening opportunities to all Americans, focusing on innovation and maximizing synergies in both federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private sector, in order to make progress in areas that previously had not been the focus of prosperity. Unfortunately, today, the national unemployment rate is 13.3%. African American and Hispanic unemployment has ballooned to 16.8 and 17.7%, respectively. We need to be focused on solutions and return to previously growing employment opportunity to people. History shows that rising incomes increase standards of living, offer communities choices and possibilities, and attract new opportunities. Part of this administration's policy that I agree with has been to modernize and clarify regulations to facilitate a more efficient, effective, and timely review process. This includes revising federal regulation to reflect current technologies and agency practices, eliminate obsolete provisions, and improve the format and clarity of regulations. Many of the environmental permitting laws have strayed from their intended objective and instead appear to have been weaponized for political motives. Unending litigation now defines and delays the permitting process for many infrastructure and energy projects. Pandemic surfaced the necessity of a reliable grid, and the ability to timely permit infrastructure is critical to maintaining that. The inability to move projects forward, imposing national security risk on the U.S. Our country has become entirely dependent on other countries for supplies of rare earth minerals, which is essential to the clean energy development. So I want to address my comments to Shay Hawkins. Shay, my staff and I enjoyed working with you when you were at Senator Scott's office. I appreciate what you're doing with the opportunity zones. And my question is this: low-income communities will be the last to recover from this economic instability. As the U.S. begins to reopen this year, we need to capitalize on opportunity zones as a tool to help the most economically distressed communities. In order to bring benefits to disadvantaged communities, how important is modernization of and certainty in federal permitting requirements?
It's absolutely critical. When you look at the issue with permitting, both on the federal level, but then also on the state and local level, the key is not necessarily a matter of moving so quickly that somehow something from a safety standpoint gets put aside. Sometimes it's just a matter of having a quick yes or no, so that the decision makers can make adjustments to get the project done, to get the business built out, accordingly. And so permitting and streamlining that process to get to a quick yes, no, or this is what's needed to move forward is critical.
I mean, the folks that are doing infrastructure and economic development projects, they need timely decision in order to create jobs.
Yes.
And the bureaucratic delays that we have seen, and everyone on this committee, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, understands there's bureaucratic delays that have affected projects in your district, whether that's economic development projects or whether that's water, rural infrastructure projects. It doesn't matter. The bureaucratic delays are hampering the process. So a yes or no answer in a timely manner is so important. And Shay, I appreciate you bringing that point. Let me just go back to what Mark Wayne Mullen was saying about broadband. I think it's important that this committee and Congress address rural broadband. In my district during the pandemic, school children didn't have access to the internet, so our school districts were bringing Wi-Fi buses into the communities to provide the Wi-Fi. Parents could bring their kids to where the bus was parked, access Wi-Fi in order for them to finish their studies for the school year. It's important for telemedicine that we've seen the importance of telemedicine in the pandemic. These are issues that this committee ought to focus on and ought to address. I want to thank the panelists for being here today, and I appreciate the hearing. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative McNerney for 5 minutes for questions. And Representative, unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member and the panelists. Good discussion so far this morning. The city of Stockton, California, which is the biggest city in my district, has one of the largest environmental justice communities in the state of California. Our community has historically borne disproportionate pollution burden as a result of redlining and other discriminatory policies such as illegal dumping and air pollution near schools. We know all too well the connection between environmental injustice and public health, as South Stockton has one of the highest rates of asthma in the United States as a result of breathing polluted air. Ms. Patterson, throughout the global coronavirus pandemic, the EPA has continued to aggressively move forward with a number of rulemaking procedures, including ones that would jeopardize the public health and environmental health. That's why this past April, I co-led a letter that was signed by 77 of my colleagues urging the EPA to extend their public comment periods by at least 45 days after the end of the declared emergency. Doing so would ensure that all Americans have an opportunity to participate in the rulemaking process. That's the expectation of the law. Do you see any way for the EPA to change course and engage our frontline communities on a fair and meaningful basis during the pandemic and beyond? Ms. Patterson.
I'm sorry, I'm just going off mute here. Yes, I mean, the EPA has historically, we've engaged extensively with them on their rulemaking hearings and comment opportunities and so forth to ensure that there's access. And we have had success with making sure that they happen in different places, and so that there's greater access. And I think that given the COVID-19 reality, one key step that the EPA will have to take is to engage with organizations that represent frontline communities to ensure that if there's Zoom calls or if there's other ways to give input, that those conversations continue to really maximize input. And in some ways, the in-person meetings can actually be supplemented by the virtual meetings where people who aren't able to be mobile or people who can't afford to go to these places can actually have other routes for participation.
All right, thank you. These are positive recommendations. I appreciate that. Also, as summer approaches, I'm concerned about what will be the impacts of extreme heat, which disproportionately impacts environmental justice communities, along with the COVID-19 and the social distancing that it requires. Would you discuss the issues as well as the need for substantive long-term solutions to addressing the impacts of extreme heat on the vulnerable populations?
Yes, unfortunately, certainly. So, coming from Chicago, where we all know, unfortunately, of the deadly heat wave that took place in 1995, I'm all too well aware. And doing the work now with organizations like Union of Concerned Scientists and many frontline communities around the urban heat island effect. We are making sure that community-led solutions around the urban heat island are being advanced both in terms of research, policy making, and implementation at the local level. So again, it really goes back to making sure that those doors are open in terms of dialogue, so that we have aggressive policy making and aggressive funding and implementation of the measures to protect communities. Everything from building retrofits that will provide better opportunities or better infrastructure for families to having cooling centers and making sure that, again, in this COVID reality, that we structure cooling centers in a way that allows for social distancing and more. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, environmental justice communities traditionally exist in food deserts as well, which create food insecurity and can have damaging impacts on the human body and its ability to fight disease. Um, can you speak to how these two issues, food insecurity and lack of access to medical care, are impacting environmental justice communities?
Absolutely, yes. Unfortunately, we've seen even with COVID-19 how the tie between both food insecurity in terms of the differential vulnerability, because food insecurity definitely exacerbates conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart conditions, and so forth, that again make folks more vulnerable to COVID-19. And then also on the other side, with COVID-19 affecting our economy, that people who already were food insecure aren't able to access food in the way that they should. So for us, we actually launched an initiative called Seeds of Resistance and Resilience to actually provide seeds to communities, as well as supplies for raised bed gardens, and then also providing demos for recipes for folks so that we can really bridge that gap in both kind of food sovereignty, so people aren't reliant on a grocery store that isn't there, but they can actually start to grow their own food and have a reliable, affordable source of consistent nutrition. So yeah, so thank you.
All right, thank you. My time's expired, and I yield back.
Hey, the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Ruiz for questions for 5 minutes, and Representative, please unmute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for testifying. I'm looking forward to eventually also discussing my Environmental Justice Act, which addresses many of the issues brought up today. It would account for the cumulative impact of pollution, provide capacity support for low-income communities, and alleviate systemic barriers. Today, we are discussing how environmental justice communities and their exposure to pollution increases underlying pulmonary illnesses and therefore increases their risk of dying from COVID-19. Consider the fact that COVID-19 is primarily a respiratory illness that severely impacts lung function. My constituents in EJ communities already face some of the highest rates of asthma, which is linked to the poor air quality from the chemical-laden dust blowing from the receding shores of the Salton Sea, dust from underdeveloped neighborhoods from years of neglecting infrastructure development investments in these underserved communities, and toxic airborne hazards from companies even without proper permits to function. Consider that hand washing is key for prevention, yet some privately owned independent water systems contain toxic levels of arsenic in their water. COVID-19 is intensifying the threat of environmental injustices to public health. A study from Harvard published in April 2020 found that long-term exposure to air pollution is associated with higher COVID-19 mortality rates. And what did the EPA do? It announced a non-enforcement policy under all environmental laws during the COVID-19 pandemic for monitoring and record-keeping requirements. Mr. Ali, after working with the EPA for 24 years, you are keenly familiar with the risks environmental justice communities face. What do you think will be the impact of EPA's decision on environmental justice communities during the pandemic?
I think more people are going to get sick and more people are going to lose their lives.
Okay. And I agree with your assessment, which is why I worked with Representative Mitigation to introduce HR 6692, the Environmental Justice COVID-19 Act, which was included in the HEROES Act and passed the House last month. This bill would provide $50 million for EPA environmental justice programs to monitor pollution and investigate the impact of COVID-19 on environmental justice communities. The EPA's Environmental Justice Small Grant Program is a grant that local groups can apply for to mitigate instances of environmental injustices. And the EPA's CARE grant programs provide support to help communities form collaborative partnerships, many like the ones that were formed here in my district, develop comprehensive understandings of risks from toxic and environmental pollutants, set priorities, identify and carry out projects to reduce risks through collaborative action at the local level. And then finally, the EJ Collaborative Problem Solving Cooperative Agreement Program helps community-based organizations partner with experts and local stakeholders to develop and implement solutions and address environmental and public health issues for underserved communities. Mr. Ali, in your experience working with the EPA, have any of these EJ grant programs helped equip EJ communities to better advocate for themselves? And how important would these grants be for them in the context of COVID-19?
These grants are extremely important in relationship to COVID-19. We created a similar program during the BP oil spill to specifically make sure that folks had the resources and information so that they could make the best decisions for themselves and to also be fully a part of the work that was going on at that time. We need to continue to fund these programs in this COVID-19 moment and beyond so that communities can build infrastructure, so that they can build stronger foundations underneath of themselves. And if I could, I'd just also like to highlight the programs that you mentioned have also been extremely important in actually transforming communities. So we've heard a lot about the opportunity zones that are doing some positive work. The collaborative problem solving model and the environmental justice small grants program was a part of the Regenesis project, which took a $20,000 grant and is now leveraged into $300 million in changes. So we often talk about investments. If we can invest $20,000 in a community and get a return of $300 million in changes, that seems like something that we should be continuing to expand.
You know, many people try to define what do you mean by systemic racial injustice? Can you talk about how the EJ community experience, especially with COVID-19, is a racial injustice, systemic injustice?
Oh, without a doubt, it runs throughout almost all the components. On the medical side, we know that there are biases in the medical system, where many times, if you're a person of color and you go to the doctor, you get, some type of a lesser diagnosis, which then can have all kinds of problems. On the environmental side, there is a racial component. We can't get away from that, but we can change it in the decision making that has happened in the past and where we have located our most toxic facilities. That is just the reality of the situation, but we can fix that problem. And then we run down through many of the other items that we've talked about today that are directly tied to a history of systemic racism. If we look at our housing had often been placed in the most dangerous locations, the lower wealth locations in floodplains, so forth and so on. And so we've seen this play out. But the message today is that we can change that. That each of the members who are here and who are in the esteemed bodies on Capitol Hill, we can decide that we want to actually do the right thing.
We can change it. We must change it so that no matter the zip code, race, or age, everyone has access to clean water and clean air. Yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Dingle for 5 minutes for questions. And Representative, unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today, and to all of the witnesses for being here on this critical subject. on disproportionate impacts on frontline communities of color and low-income families. In Michigan, we've been particularly hit hard. We're fourth in the number of deaths in the country. We have nearly 2 million unemployed, and lives have been forever changed. And what's most troubling is that African Americans make up 40% of the COVID deaths in Michigan, and they're only 14% of the population. For too long, these communities have had to bear the brunt of the burden during the worst of times. And as people are bravely marching peacefully against injustice across this country, we have to renew our fight for greater environmental justice. Every bill that Congress considers now must take these issues into account. But today I want to focus my questions on access to clean drinking water. I thank Chairman Tonko for recognizing the issue at the very beginning of this, its affordability, and why it is so important for environmental justice communities during a pandemic. But I worry about it when we're done too, because I believe that water is a basic human right. Because COVID didn't create a water crisis, it exacerbated the existing one. Mr. Hawkins, I love you, even though you're from Ohio State or from Ohio, but I'm going to, hey, we got to keep a little sports humor in all of this, or we're going to, I miss sports. But I want to address my questions to Mr. Ali and Ms. Patterson. According to the CDC, one of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of COVID is to wash your hands for 20 seconds regularly with soap and water. But you can't do that if you don't have any running water. Access to clean water is a basic human right, and it's critical for hygiene and safety. I'd like to first start with you, Mr. O'Lally, but ask you to be short, and then Ms. Patterson. Could both of you give this community an overview of how COVID-19 has impacted the access to clean water in environmental justice communities? And would you tell us or highlight what we can do as a federal government as far as things stand today for water shutoffs nationally? And what do we need to do to make sure it continues to flow?
Well, the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we're strengthening our infrastructure and making sure that in the strengthening of the infrastructure that we are also making sure that our most vulnerable communities, as in relationship to the pricing of water, we need to make sure that there is actually equity that's a part of that process. We also have to make sure that with and extend the moratorium on water shutoffs. There in Detroit and across the country, folks like Ms. Monica Patrick with We the People of Detroit and others have been working diligently to make sure that that is brought to the attention of folks both in the State House and the Federal House. So we have to do that. We also got to make sure we're making investments in our natural infrastructure, which helps to clean water. And helps to take a burden off of many of the water filtration systems that are out there. So those are just a couple of things, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Patterson.
Ms. Patterson.
Thank you so much. Yes, so definitely echoing what Mr. Ali said, and just to add that we also need to make sure that we are pushing back against water privatization, and so that we don't have water systems that are run for profit, that we make sure that we have water systems that are meant to serve people and to uphold human rights. We definitely have to increase our investments, as Mr. Ali said, in water infrastructure, so that we don't, because even now, one thing that was exacerbated by COVID-19 is that to the extent that there's some folks who don't trust their water and they have to access through water bottles and so forth. And so having to do that when you don't even have a grocery store nearby, and given the weight of water, and so people are in harm's way just trying to get water that they can drink because the water coming out of their pipes isn't safe. So we need to make sure that we don't have, especially as we know that by all accounts, the COVID-19 is going to resurge. It's still going on now, and we're going to have a resurgence of it. So we need to have permanent solutions and not just temporary moratoriums on water shutoffs, but no one should be deprived of the essential resource of water. And so definitely following in the footsteps as Mr. Ali said, the folks of We the People of Detroit, to have a community governance structure around water systems is something that we should definitely institute. Thank you.
So I'm out of time, but I would like to thank the committee leadership because water is a basic human right, which is the bill that I introduced with my colleague, was included in the most recent bill passed by the House, the HEROES bill. And there are 15 million people in the United States that don't have running water or have had a water shut off. We all need to really think about that. 1 in 20 households in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're most welcome. And the General Lady yields back. I believe we next have Representative Burgess available for 5 minutes for questions. Representative, unmute, please.
Yes, sure. Thanks. Thanks for letting me wave onto the subcommittee. It's been a fascinating discussion during the day. Mr. Hawkins, if I could ask you in regards to opportunity zones, and I was intrigued. I actually pulled the opportunity zones for the congressional district that I represent.
Yes.
My former life, physician and my medical practice was actually located right in the smack dab in the middle of an opportunity zone. And had I only known, perhaps I could have accessed some significant help. But so what is in your experience with healthcare facilities in opportunity zones? What are some of the possibilities? What are some of the opportunities there?
Sure. And so just as a quick note, had you had your practice in an opportunity zone, you wouldn't have been able to draw the benefit just from existing there. You have actually had to make a substantial improvement on your practice, which is to say, you would have to invest the full cost basis of your business in improving that business in order to access the benefits. So, let's say that you have a business that's worth $500,000. In order to benefit from the policy, you have to invest an additional $500,000 on new employees, a better facility, or other significant improvements in order to draw the policy. So that's one of the things. So you can look at every existing healthcare business in an opportunity zone as benefiting. You can also look at building out rural broadband, building out urban broadband, so that telehealth is a broader option. We can look at, again, when we're looking at one of our members, they're going to be distributing test kits, but then also building modular testing facilities so that folks can do the tests separate and apart from the broader hospital facility, but still within an accessible distance. And so all of those are things that we've seen built out, sort of in the healthcare space. And the communities that are designated as opportunity zones, do suffer from current worse health outcomes, but also worse health conditions than the population at large, obviously.
Just as a point, a data point, my medical practice in the late 1980s when the savings and loans imploded across the country. You're probably too young to remember that. The Resolution Trust Corporation came to town. I attempted to get an SBA loan back then and was unsuccessful. But that's a different story for a different time. Can you speak to the same issues in the energy sector? Are there places where the opportunity zones intersect with with businesses that provide and distribute energy?
Sure. Well, as I note in my testimony, there's already sort of a jump that the designated opportunity zones has on clean energy, with 475 solar facilities being built out so far. So anything that involves significant innovation in the energy space, you're going to see. But beyond that, there's two elements for more traditional energy where we've seen a lot of growth. One is folks who are providing services to existing energy companies. So, again, we have members up in Alaska And there's folks who provide, for BP and others that are operating in the north of the country. There's folks that provide services for them, everything from uniforms to lunches and food for the workers and things along those lines. But then for the larger energy companies, they can benefit from the policy and benefit by building out a subsidiary within an opportunity zone.
Okay.
Because the idea is if you're going to be hiring folks, if you're going to be bringing new workers in, and if you're going to be bringing more resources to these areas, then we don't mind if you're an existing company. You just drop a subsidiary down in a zone and you're good to go.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ali, I apologize. I wanted to get to you and give you an opportunity to address the issue about enforcement that you started to earlier. And I don't guess we had the chance, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that before this concludes today. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and we now recognize Representative Clark for 5 minutes of questioning. And unmute, please, Representative.
Thank you so much, Chairman Tonko and Ranking Member Shimkus, for holding this hearing today on environmental justice. And thank you to all three of our witnesses for joining and offering your testimony. Let me just begin by saying that I think this is both an extremely important and extremely relevant hearing for us to be having in this particular moment in our nation's history. As we grapple with the long legacy of systemic racism and injustice that continues to permeate the many echelons of our society and its institutions. The protests and public outcry during this past couple of weeks over the killing and abuse of Black women and men at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve them add to this the disparities that have been laid bare in recent months regarding the impacts of the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic are, in my eyes, highly related events. They have served to bring those deep and pervasive injustices to the foreground of the national conversation. This intersectionality is undeniable. I also believe that the COVID-19 pandemic in particular has shown us, perhaps more clearly than ever, that issues of environmental justice do not simply exist alone amongst themselves in a vacuum. To the contrary, environmental injustices have wide-ranging impacts that manifest themselves in all manner of social, economic, and health-related ways. And the times of great crisis tend to both amplify and be amplified by environmental injustices within most vulnerable communities. My first question, so is to begin my line of questioning, I'd like to first focus on the issue of air pollution that continues to be a major source of environmental injustice in my Brooklyn community. In fact, Brownsville, Brooklyn, one of the neighborhoods within my congressional district, actually has the highest rates of adult asthma out of any neighborhood in New York City. We know from years upon years of research that reveals that Black, Latinx, and Native American communities in this country suffer disproportionately from respiratory and cardiovascular conditions, including asthma, as a direct result of environmental factors such as high levels of local air pollution. We also know that COVID-19, which is predominantly a respiratory virus, has impacted the Black, Latinx, and Native American communities at rates that far exceed their share of the population. So my first question is to Dr. Ali. Can you first please share with us your thoughts on the connection between air pollution and the disparities that we've seen with COVID-19? And can you also tell us from an environmental justice perspective, where you think our focus should be when it comes to addressing this major issue of air pollution in communities like Brooklyn?
Definitely. Thank you, Congresswoman. We all know now that the data is out there that there's a direct connection between the air pollution, PM 2.5, PM 10, and also ultrafine particulates in relationship to communities of color and lower wealth communities and on indigenous lands. And we also know that there are chronic medical conditions that come from the exposure to this air pollution. And we also know that as the temperature rises, that air pollution also becomes more deadly. So knowing that we have these factors coming together along with those chronic medical conditions that make us more susceptible to the coronavirus would lead one to believe that we should be doing everything that we can to lessen the emissions that are happening inside of these communities of color. And that can be done by making sure that we're not only honoring the Clean Air Act and all of the respective parts that are there, but also that enforcement is actually happening inside of these communities to make sure that folks are living up to the letter of the law.
Much for that. I want to turn just quickly to the issue of housing. Here in Brooklyn, New York, we've had a lead paint scandal with thousands of adults and children living in public housing exposed to toxic levels of lead paint. After Superstorm Sandy, right here in New York, we saw that the worst impacts took place among our low-income communities and communities of color, who did not have the resources to receive the assistance quickly to rebuild and relocate their homes. Now, again, with the coronavirus pandemic, we see how important it is to have a home environment that is both safe and affordable. Ms. Patterson, do you believe that having access to safe and affordable housing goes hand in hand with achieving environmental justice? And what do you think can be done on the federal level to achieve greater environmental justice when it comes to housing in our nation?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, so absolutely, housing justice is integral to environmental justice and the safety and well-being of our families, communities, individuals. And so yes, we absolutely need better subsidies for housing retrofits and improvements, not just in terms of energy efficiency, but also in terms of lead remediation. And because we're seeing disproportionately, whether it's lead, asbestos, radon, all of these indoor air pollutants that are compounding the other toxins that are affecting homes. We also need to be thinking about not just improving poor housing, but we need to be thinking about land security and housing security as a whole, and thinking about how do we put more folks on the pathway towards home ownership. We know that Black land loss is something that is historic and present day, and we also know that land ownership and housing ownership is key to climate resilience and economic security in general. So we need to have much more in the way of programs that lead to a pathway of home ownership and housing security. Thank you.
I thank you all, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, the gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes Representative Schakowsky for 5 minutes of questioning. And Representative, unmute, please.
I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Hear you. So you're doing fine.
Okay, very good. Thank you. This has been an amazing hearing. I really appreciate it. The city of Chicago has been deeply affected by environmental injustice. And we know that in Chicago, African Americans account for 60% of the city's COVID-19 related deaths, despite the fact that they represent about 30% of the population of the city of Chicago. And I think that this hearing has really made clearly the point that EJ communities have been double deeply affected by the virus and all the existing problems that have come before it, and that it's a public health as well as an environmental health issue. This administration has rolled back or plans to reverse over 100 environmental rules. Must be particularly painful to you, Mr. Ali, to see that happening. And in fact, just this week, we have seen the president sign an executive order to accelerate permitting of major infrastructure programs and projects, waiving environmental review for pipeline and highways and other projects. Experts warn that this action will have a disproportionately negative impact on the communities that we've been talking about. So, Mr. Ali, what I want to ask you, the president had talked about warm weather is going to get rid of this virus, but I just heard you say that you thought that the summer temperatures, the higher temperatures are actually going to exacerbate the problems. Is that true?
Well, warmer weather exacerbates air pollution.
Yes.
You find it with smog and many of the other things that you see. It also impacts ozone. So all of that coming together just causes additional burdens in these communities.
Thank you for that. I wanted to read something from the United States Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice as, quote, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And I am just wondering, Mr. Ali, and I'd also like to ask Ms. Patterson about that. If you really see that happening, particularly the issue of meaningful involvement of those communities.
Well, I'll start very quickly with both of those aspects because I was around when we created that definition. Fair treatment, most definitely not. If there was fair treatment, there would be honest analysis about these additional impacts that are going on in our most vulnerable communities, in communities of color, lower wealth communities, and on indigenous land. Meaningful involvement. If there was true meaningful involvement, then we would be engaging with the individuals before these decisions are being made to be able to mitigate the impacts that are happening. And the interesting thing is that the Environmental Protection Agency has even said with some of the actions that they have done, some of the rolling back, if you will, that there are going to be less lives that are protected. So I'm not sure how you can make a statement that says less people are going to be protected, but I'm okay with that. These are our tax dollars that are literally being utilized to impact these communities, and that's unacceptable.
Do I have any moments left for Ms. Patterson to speak to that?
Okay, if there are. So yeah, I will just reiterate what Mr. Ali said in terms of if certainly fair treatment wouldn't mean that we have kids who are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack and 3 times more likely to enter in the hospital from an asthma attack. Fair treatment wouldn't mean that we would have adults who are more likely to die of lung cancer but less likely to smoke. Fair treatment would mean that we are disproportionately located in cancer clusters throughout the nation. And if we had equal engagement, then these things wouldn't be happening in the first place because our communities know the solutions that are going to protect our health and well-being. So in answer to your question, definitely not fair treatment and definitely not meaningful engagement, or the world would look a lot different. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Am I out of time? I can't.
You are out of time.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So the gentlelady, okay, the gentlelady yields back. Now I believe we go to Representative Castor for. Oh, I'm sorry. We go to Representative Kennedy for 5 minutes of questions, and Representative Kennedy, unmute and ready to go.
Mr. Tonko, thank you. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today and the extremely important conversation. The desperate impacts of COVID-19 are obvious and nationwide. In Massachusetts, they are also undeniable. All of the communities with the highest rates of COVID-19 in Massachusetts are also environmental justice communities. Last month, I sent a letter to President Trump calling for the appointment of an environmental justice expert to the coronavirus task force and calling for all future actions to prioritize communities that are most at risk. But it's clear that we need to do much more than that. We need to confront the causes of air pollution that increase rates of asthma and other comorbidities that leave our communities uniquely vulnerable, not just to pandemics, but to countless health challenges every single day. So, Ms. Patterson, I want to start with you. I know you've touched on this a bit, but how do we right this ship and how do we give communities of color and people of color more voice in the government's response to COVID-19?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So certainly we have to have more of a sorry, I'm trying to think of how to articulate this, more forums for community engagement and community decision making I know it's been a tough pivot because of some of our traditional ways of having community engagement haven't been available to us in terms of hearings and so forth. But we have to make that pivot because, as I said before, communities do know the solutions that will work for them, and so we need to engage with frontline base building groups that know how to connect with communities and figure out how we're gonna pave those pathways for dialogue, for input, and for shared decision making around solutions at work. That's my first short answer. I know you have limited time, but.
No, thank you. And Mr. Ali, what are your thoughts?
Well, there are some things that I shared with the administration when they first came in. One of them is that at the Environmental Protection Agency, they should have a senior advisor for environmental justice. I don't know how you can adequately address these issues if you don't have someone who's sharing with the administrator, okay, if you go this way, this is going to happen. If you go that way, that's going to happen. In relationship to the White House, they should also have someone who has expertise in these areas to also help them. So if you're working on opportunity zones, you should also have someone who understands environmental justice to help to make sure that that process is fully engaging and protecting all the folks. And if you really want to get good with it, then you make sure that the 17 federal agencies that have a responsibility for environmental justice out of Executive Order 12898 also have senior leadership who's talking to Ben Carson at HUD and saying, hey, here's what some of the impacts are. How can we think critically about our resources to make real change happen? Or at the Department of Energy, how do we make sure that we are leveraging our resources and expertise to actually uplift these communities? So we've been having a conversation about economics and jobs, along with the impacts that are happening from COVID-19. So let's also make sure that the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce and the Small Business Administration also have someone who's having these conversations with them. And they're also opening up the doors to make sure that frontline communities are helping to lead many of those conversations, since the impacts, whether negative or positive, are going to come back to their communities. Mm-hmm. And that is what representative government should be looking like. And that is how we actually get real people helping to frame out policy and actions that benefit everyone.
Mm. So building off of that, Congress and in particular the Senate still has serious work to do to respond to the pandemic and help our country recover. The last thing we should include in our recovery efforts is a bailout for big fossil fuel companies. So, Mr. Ali, how would bailing out oil and gas while failing to invest in environmental protections for environmental justice communities hurt Black and Latinx individuals?
I mean, in so many ways, it's funny, the oil companies, and so let me say it this way. Going back to my early statement with my grandmother, when she said, when you know better, do better. If this was 100 years ago, 75 years ago, of course, fossil fuels played a huge role and were necessary in helping to build the infrastructure of our country. We now know that there are other opportunities. So when we move resources to those entities that are playing a role in impacting our communities, there's something wrong with that formula when we're not also equally moving opportunities to cleaner forms of energy and also rebuilding these communities that have been impacted by the actions that we are supporting now with our dollars and that we did in the past.
I'll have to leave it with that. Thank you both. Yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I believe that concludes all of our colleagues that wish to ask questions of our witnesses. If so, then I would like to thank our witnesses for joining us for today's hearing. Your input has been very valuable. I remind members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 business days by which to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by our witnesses. And I ask that our witnesses to please respond promptly to any such questions that they may receive. I now request unanimous consent to enter a number of documents into the record.
I'm trying. I can't get on. Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. I have some documents I was going to announce. Do you have additional ones there?
I don't know if they're additional. But I'll just go through them real quick. And I know that they've been vetted. Can I just name them real quick?
Sure.
the June 8, 2020 letter to EPA Administrator Wheeler to committee outlining concerns with the lack of peer review of the Harvard study. May 13th, 2020 letter from EPA, New York Attorney General's Office outlining EPA's COVID-19 temporary enforcement policy, and that the EPA is continuing to enforce the laws. June 2020 letter from EPA to Congress with EPA's 2019 air trends report, showing reductions in emissions. August 2018 letter from the Conference of Mayors to the IRS in support of opportunity zones. And the last one being this 2020 Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies trends and success reports showing improvements across the country. Those are the
Right.
five that we had.
Okay, I also did have a letter from WEAC for environmental justice, a letter from the West End Revitalization Association, and I believe a report by EPA entitled Our Nation's Air 2020. Does that conclude all?
I think that's
And a bicameral letter to the EPA.
okay. I think we've all agreed upon those.
Okay, so with all of those, there's a request for unanimous consent to enter the documents into the record.
Without objection.
No objection, without objection, so ordered. So at this time, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Great job, Chairman.
Thank you very much, everybody.